Location, Big Bend National Park, Texas. Date, May 28, 2019. The Chihuahuan Desert doesn't ease you into its brutality. It announces itself immediately, with heat that feels like a physical presence pressing down from a colorless sky. Marcus Rivera had been a ranger at Big Bend for exactly 23 days, and he still wasn't used to the way the sun felt out here. Not like warmth, but like punishment. Like the desert itself was testing whether you belonged, and hadn't yet decided if it would let you stay. He stood outside the Panther Junction Visitor Center at 6:15 a.m., before the building officially opened, and the thermometer already read 87 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon it would hit 105, maybe 110. Late May in the Chihuahuan Desert, the hottest part of Texas, where the land stretched brown and infinite toward mountains that looked close enough to touch but were actually 20 miles away. Distance was a liar out here. So was time. So was the idea that you were ever truly alone. Marcus had grown up in El Paso, had spent every summer of his childhood crossing into Juarez to stay with his grandmother Lupe. She'd lived in a small house on the outskirts of the city, close enough to the desert that you could walk to its edge in 10 minutes. She taught him Spanish, had fed him tamales and stories in equal measure, had warned him about the things that lived in the border regions, things that didn't respect lines on maps or the laws of men. El desierto tiene memoria, mijo, she told him once while they sat on her porch watching the sun set over the mountains. The desert has memory. It remembers everything that's ever happened on its land. Every death, every disappearance, every darkness. And some things, they never leave. They just wait. He thought she was being poetic. Old people were like that, turning simple observations into mystical warnings. But now, standing in the pre-dawn heat of Big Bend with 800,000 acres of emptiness stretched out around him, he wondered if she'd been trying to prepare him for something. Marcus sipped from his water bottle, already his third of the morning, and watched the sun creep over the Chisos Mountains to the east. The light came harsh and unfiltered, turning the desert floor from shadow blue to dusty gold in minutes, beautiful in its way. The Ocotillo plants stood like skeletal fingers against the brightening sky, and in the distance, a roadrunner darted between creosote bushes, the first sign of animal life he'd seen all morning. But Marcus had grown up in El Paso, had spent summers in Juarez visiting his grandmother, and he knew desert beauty was always dangerous. The prettier it looked, the more it wanted to kill you. His uniform shirt was already damp with sweat despite the early hour, clinging to his back and shoulders. The fabric was technical, designed to wick moisture and provide UV protection, but no amount of engineering could make 87 degrees at dawn feel comfortable. By the time his shift ended at 5 that afternoon, he'd have drunk 2 gallons of water, minimum. Maybe 3. Dehydration wasn't just uncomfortable out here. It was a death sentence that crept up on you faster than most people realized. His radio crackled, breaking the morning silence. Panther Junction, this is Rodriguez at Castellon. Morning check. Marcus unclipped the radio from his belt, pressed the transmission button. His supervisor, Elena Rodriguez, had been at Big Bend for 12 years and knew the park the way some people knew their own homes. Every trail, every water source, every place where the desert could kill you if you weren't careful. She was patient with Marcus's rookie mistakes, but he could tell she was still evaluating whether he'd last past his first summer. A lot of new rangers didn't. The isolation got to them, or the heat, or the sheer emptiness of a park that covered 163 acres with only a handful of staff to watch over it. Morning, Elena. All quiet here. Opening in 15 minutes. His voice sounded strange in the desert silence, too loud, intrusive. Good. Check the overnight permit log when you get a chance. I saw we had a group of 4 head out yesterday afternoon for the Dodson Trail. They were supposed to camp at Zone 3 and hike back this morning, but I want to make sure they filed their exit time. Marcus pulled out his phone, navigating to the digital permit system. Cell signal was spotty out here, but it loaded after a moment. Yeah, I see them. Party of 4. Hannah Lee, Ethan Brooks, Chloe Martinez, Derek Walsh, all from Austin. Exit time listed as 9 a.m. today. Okay, just keep an eye out. Dodson's not a hard trail, but people underestimate the heat this time of year. Make sure they took enough water. Elena paused, and when she spoke again, her tone had shifted to something more serious. And Marcus, if they're not back by 10:30, call me. Don't wait until noon or start thinking they're just running late. Out here, late can mean dead. Understand? Marcus felt a chill, despite the climbing heat. In his training, they'd covered search and rescue protocols, heat-related emergencies, all the standard stuff. But hearing it from Elena, who'd actually dealt with lost hikers and heat exhaustion and bodies that had been in the desert too long, that made it real. Copy that. I'll call if they're not back by 10:30. Good. And one more thing. Did you check the lunar calendar? No. Why? New moon last night. No moon at all. Just something to keep in mind if anyone reports anything unusual. She paused. Not that they will, but the new moon, sometimes it brings out things that usually stay hidden. Before Marcus could ask what she meant by that, the radio went silent. He stared at it for a moment, then clipped it back to his belt. Elena wasn't the type to be superstitious, which made the comment about the new moon even stranger. He headed inside to start opening procedures. The visitor center was a low adobe-style building designed to blend with the desert landscape, all earth tones and small windows to keep out the brutal sun. Inside, the air conditioning hummed, a sound Marcus had come to associate with safety, with the thin bubble of civilization in the middle of 800,000 acres of nothing. The contrast from outside was shocking, like stepping from an oven into a refrigerator. His skin prickled with the sudden cold, and he stood in the doorway for a moment, letting his body adjust. The interior smelled like dust and old paper, with underlying notes of coffee and the chemical scent of disinfectant used to mop the floors. Marcus moved through his routine with practiced efficiency now, after 3 weeks of doing the same tasks every morning. Unlock the doors, turn on the lights, boot up the computer at the front desk, check that the display cases were intact, the brochures properly stocked, the emergency contact numbers posted clearly by the phone. He was filling the coffee maker when the front door opened. Too early for visitors. They weren't officially open yet. Marcus turned, expecting maybe one of the maintenance crew or another ranger stopping by before heading out on patrol. Instead, an older man stood in the doorway, backlit by the rising sun so Marcus couldn't see his face clearly at first. He was local. Marcus could tell immediately. Weathered brown skin, eyes that had seen decades of desert sun, work clothes that looked like they'd been earned honestly rather than bought for fashion, straw cowboy hat with sweat stains around the band, boots that were scuffed and dusty but well-maintained. The man approached the desk with the slow, deliberate walk of someone who knew better than to rush in this heat, and as he got closer, Marcus could see he was probably in his 60s or 70s. Hard to tell. The desert aged people differently than cities did. "Morning," the man said. His accent was thick border Tejano, words shaped by a lifetime of switching between English and Spanish mid-sentence, the two languages flowing together as naturally as breathing. "You're the new ranger, right? Rivera?" Marcus felt a small surprise at being recognized. "Yes, sir. Marcus Rivera. How can I help you?" The man studied him for a long moment, his gaze sharp and assessing. "Your grandmother was Lupe Rivera? From Juarez?" Now Marcus was genuinely surprised. His grandmother had passed away 5 years ago, and he hadn't expected anyone out here to know her. "Yes? Did you know her?" "Knew of her. Good woman, smart woman. Knew the old ways, respected them." The man leaned against the desk, his posture casual but his eyes still watchful. "She teach you anything about the borderlands? About what lives out here besides snakes and coyotes and mountain lions?" Something in the man's tone made Marcus's instincts prickle with unease. This wasn't small talk. This was leading somewhere specific. "I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name." "Esteban Morales. I run cattle on the land adjacent to the park. Been here 40 years. My family's been in this area for 6 generations." He pulled off his hat, wiped sweat from his forehead with a bandana. "And I'm asking because we lost 2 calves last week. Found them 3 days later, up in a mesquite tree. 40, 50 feet up. No predator I know puts a full-grown calf in a tree like that. Marcus opened his mouth to suggest mountain lions. They cached kills in trees sometimes. He'd learned that in training. But Esteban cut him off with a raised hand. Not lions. I know lions. Been dealing with them my whole life. They drag kills into trees, yeah, but not like this. These calves were arranged, laid out on branches like someone put them there deliberately. And the wounds... He trailed off, shaking his head. Not bite marks. Looked more like something grabbed them. Something with talons. Could be a large bird. Golden eagles, Eagles don't hunt calves. And they sure as hell don't have a 6-7 foot wingspan. Esteban's expression had gone hard. You know what does? What the old people say haunts these borderlands? Marcus knew. His grandmother had told him the stories, whispered them to him on hot summer nights when the windows were open and the desert stretched dark beyond the porch light. But he'd thought they were just stories. Cautionary tales to keep children from wandering off, to teach respect for the wild places. La lechuza, Marcus said quietly. Esteban nodded. The owl witch. My grandfather used to tell stories about her. Said she'd been hunting the borderlands for longer than anyone could remember. Sometimes she appeared as a woman, sometimes as an owl, bigger than any bird should be. She could whistle, could call in human voices, could make you think you were hearing a friend or family member crying for help. And if you followed those calls... He made a gesture like something swooping down, claws extended. Mr. Morales, I appreciate you coming in, but those are just folk stories. They're not... You've got people out there. Esteban nodded toward the desert beyond the windows, toward the trails that wound into places where the Park Service map turned to blank space. Saw their car at the Dodson trailhead yesterday evening when I was checking fence lines. 4 young people in a Jeep, Arizona plates, packing up like they were going to camp overnight. They know it was a new moon last night? No light at all? They have flashlights, headlamps. They're experienced hikers according to their permit. Maybe so. Maybe they've hiked all over. Joshua Tree, Death Valley, places like that. Esteban put his hat back on, adjusted it carefully. But those places don't have La Lechuza. Those places don't have something that's been hunting for centuries, that knows these canyons better than any human ever will, that gets hungry when the moon goes dark. Marcus wanted to dismiss it, wanted to politely show this old rancher to the door and get back to his normal routine of answering questions about parking and trail conditions. But something in Esteban's expression stopped him. This wasn't the look of someone telling campfire stories or indulging in superstition. This was the look of someone who'd seen something he couldn't explain and was trying to warn someone else. What do you want me to do? Marcus asked finally. When they come back, if they come back, ask them what they heard in the dark. Ask them what they saw. Then decide if I'm just a crazy old man telling stories. Esteban headed for the door, then paused with his hand on the handle. And Marcus, your grandmother would have listened to me. She knew that the best way to survive the desert is to respect what you don't understand. You might want to remember that. He left, and Marcus stood alone in the air-conditioned visitor center, feeling the weight of something he couldn't quite name. The coffee maker beeped, signaling it was done brewing, and he poured himself a cup with hands that were slightly unsteady. La Lechuza, the owl witch. A legend he'd heard as a child and filed away with Santa Claus and the Tooth Fairy. Comforting fictions meant to teach lessons or scare kids into obedience. But Esteban Morales hadn't looked like someone talking about fiction. He'd looked like someone delivering a warning about something very, very real. 24 hours earlier, Hannah Lee had been driving her Jeep down Highway 118 toward Big Bend with 3 of her closest friends, all of them laughing. Music loud, windows down to let in the desert wind that smelled like creosote and dust and infinite space. Holy shit, look at that, Ethan had said from the passenger seat, pointing at the mountains rising ahead of them. The Chisos Range cut across the horizon like broken teeth, purple-gray in the afternoon haze, looking more like a painting than something real. That's where we're going? Near there, Hannah confirmed. She'd done most of the planning for this trip, had researched trails and campsites and water sources for weeks. The Dodson Trail had looked perfect in all her research. Moderate difficulty, good views, Primitive camping that would feel like real wilderness without being genuinely dangerous. The trailhead is on the western side. We'll camp at a spot about 6 miles in near Fresno Canyon. She'd been planning trips like this since college. Group adventures to national parks, mountains, deserts, anywhere they could disconnect from the endless digital noise of their lives in Austin. Hannah was 26 now, worked in marketing for a tech company, and needed these escapes more than she used to. The city felt suffocating sometimes, all concrete and traffic and people. Out here, with 800,000 acres of emptiness and her best friends and nothing to do but walk and breathe and exist, she felt like herself again. "How hot is it going to get?" Chloe asked from the back seat. She was already sunburned from their stop at Santa Elena Canyon earlier that day. Despite the SPF 50 she'd applied liberally. Her skin was the kind that burned rather than tanned, a constant struggle in a state where the sun felt personal in its aggression. Derek, sitting beside her, checked his phone. "Weather app says 104 tomorrow." Jesus. And I thought Austin summers were bad. "We'll start hiking around 4, Hannah said. "Do most of it in the evening when it's cooler, make camp before dark, then hike out early tomorrow before it gets brutal. We'll be back at the car by 9:30 at the latest. Easy day." It was a good plan. A solid plan based on research and experience. Hannah had done plenty of desert hiking before. Joshua Tree multiple times, Death Valley, parts of Big Bend on previous trips. She knew about heat exhaustion, about water requirements, 1 liter per hour of hiking, more if it was over 100 degrees, about not underestimating the sun just because you felt fine in the moment. What she didn't know, what no guidebook or hiking app could have told her, was that some things in the desert didn't care about your planning. Some things were older than plans, older than maps, older than the idea that humans could navigate wilderness safely if they just followed the right protocols. They reached the Dodson trailhead at 4:30 p.m., later than Hannah had wanted, but not dangerously so. The parking area was barely more than a widened shoulder, space for maybe 3 vehicles. Empty except for a dusty pickup truck that looked like it had been there for days, maybe weeks. Hannah felt a small thrill at that. They'd have the trail to themselves, maybe the whole canyon. True wilderness experience, the kind you couldn't get at more popular parks. The heat hit them like a physical blow when they got out of the air-conditioned Jeep. Hannah's sunglasses fogged immediately, and she had to wipe them on her shirt before she could see clearly. The temperature had dropped slightly from its midday peak, but it was still over 100 degrees, and the sun beat down with that particular desert intensity that seemed designed to remind humans they didn't belong here. "Fuck, it's hot," Ethan said, already reaching for his water bottle. "Language," Derek teased, but he was sweating too, and they'd only been outside for 30 seconds. They geared up, checking and rechecking their supplies. Hannah had made everyone show her their packs before they left Austin. Wasn't taking any chances with people who thought winging it was an acceptable hiking strategy. 4 liters of water each, plus 2 extra gallons in camp that they'd carry in turns. Food for dinner and breakfast. First aid kit, map, compass, GPS device with fresh batteries, headlamps and flashlights, emergency shelter, sunscreen, bug spray, toilet paper, hand sanitizer. Everything by the book, everything careful. "Everybody ready?" Hannah asked, shouldering her pack. It was heavy, probably 40 pounds with the water, but she'd trained for this, had done weekend hikes with a weighted pack for the past month. "Ready," they chorused. They signed the trail register, Hannah writing carefully. "Party of 4H. Lee, E. Brooks, C. Martinez, D. Walsh. Entry, 4:47 p.m., May 27th. Expected exit, 9:01 a.m., May 28th. Her handwriting looked neat and confident on the page, like someone who knew what they were doing, who'd thought of everything. The trail began easy, a well-worn path through creosote bush and ocotillo, heading gradually upward toward the foothills. The creosote smelled sharp and medicinal in the heat, and their boots kicked up small clouds of dust with each step. Within 5 minutes, Hannah's shirt was soaked with sweat. Within 10, she'd drunk half a liter of water. The desert stretched around them in shades of brown and gray and dusty green, not the lifeless wasteland people imagined. but a landscape full of careful life that knew how to survive in impossible conditions. Beryl cactus hunched like little green spheres conserving water. Ocotillo plants waved their spiny branches at the sky. Century plants thrust up their flowering stalks, spending everything they had on one spectacular bloom before dying. For the first hour, everything was perfect. They made good time, joking and talking, stopping occasionally to take photos of the landscape. Hannah took several shots of the Chisos Mountains, trying to capture the way they looked purple in the distance, trying to get the scale right. But photographs always failed to convey the enormity of the desert, the way it made you feel small and temporary. Ethan was telling a story about a disastrous camping trip in Colorado, where their tent had blown away in the night, and everyone was laughing. Chloe kept stopping to identify plants. She was in grad school for botany, and got genuinely excited about things like different species of sage. Derek had brought his harmonica, and would occasionally play a few bars of something bluesy and mournful that seemed to fit the landscape. They were having fun. They were doing everything right. And none of them noticed how quiet the desert had become, how all the birdsong had stopped, how even the insects had gone silent. None of them noticed they were being watched. Around 6 p.m., as the sun started its descent toward the horizon, Derek called for a water break. They'd covered about 4 miles, were making better time than Hannah had estimated. She felt pleased with herself, with the group, with the whole trip. This was what she'd needed: space and sun and the simple pleasure of putting one foot in front of the other. "This place is insane," Ethan said, drinking deeply from his water bottle. They'd stopped in the thin shade of a juniper tree, the only shelter in sight. "Like, actually insane. Look at all that nothing." He gestured at the expanse of desert stretching in every direction, mountains rising in the distance, the sky vast and empty. "We could be the only people for 50 miles. "We probably are," Chloe said, also drinking. Her face was flushed red despite the sunscreen, and Hannah made a mental note to make sure she kept hydrating. "Didn't the ranger say Big Bend gets like 500,000 visitors a year? But it's 800,000 acres. That's less than 1 person per acre. Do the math. We're basically alone out here." "Math major," Derek teased, but he looked impressed. He wiped sweat from his forehead with his bandana, leaving a streak of dust across his skin. They kept hiking as the sun dropped lower, and the desert began its transformation from hostile oven to something almost beautiful. The temperature was finally bearable, even pleasant. The light turned golden, then orange, then deep purple. Shadows lengthened across the canyon floor, and the mountains seemed to glow from within. This was Hannah's favorite time in the desert, after the day's heat broke, but before darkness fell completely. The golden hour, photographers called it, when everything looked touched by magic. They reached their planned campsite just as the last light faded, a flat area on a slight rise, protected from wind by a semicircle of rock outcroppings. Hannah had picked it from the satellite imagery, and it looked even better in person. Natural shelter, good drainage in case of flash floods, and positioned so they'd get the sunrise in the morning. "Perfect spot," Derek said, dropping his pack with an audible sigh of relief. They set up their 2 tents efficiently, Hannah and Chloe in one, Derek and Ethan in the other. Hung their food bags from a juniper tree 20 feet away, high enough that no animals could reach them. Set up their little camp stove on a flat rock. Everything by protocol, everything careful, everything right. The darkness came fast once the sun was gone, faster than it ever did in the city. No streetlights out here, no glow from nearby buildings or passing cars, just the rapid transition from twilight to complete darkness. And tonight, with the new moon, there was no natural light at all, just stars, thousands of them, so bright and numerous that Hannah could actually see her shadow cast by starlight. "No fire?" Ethan asked. Hannah shook her head. "Probably not necessary. It's still warm, and we don't want to attract attention if there are any rangers patrolling." She pulled out her headlamp, clicked it on. The LED beam cut through the darkness, harsh and artificial. Besides, fires are kind of a pain to build in the desert anyway. Not enough wood. Attention from rangers or attention from something else? Derek said it like a joke, but his voice had an edge that suggested he was only half kidding. What do you mean? I don't know, man. This place just feels watchful. Is that weird to say? Derek was looking out into the darkness beyond their campsite, beyond the small circle of illumination cast by their headlamps. Hannah looked around, nothing but darkness and stars and the vague shapes of rocks and plants at the edge of visibility. It's just the isolation getting to you. You're not used to being this far from civilization. You're used to Austin, where you can see neighbors' lights and hear traffic and know you're surrounded by people. Maybe. But Derek kept glancing at the darkness, like he expected something to emerge from it, like he could feel eyes on them. They ate dinner, camp stove meals, nothing fancy, dehydrated pasta that they rehydrated with boiling water, energy bars, trail mix, the kind of efficient calories that tasted like cardboard but gave you what you needed. They ate sitting on their sleeping pads, passing around the pot because they'd only brought 2 sporks. The conversation was normal, comfortable, plans for tomorrow's hike, complaints about work, gossip about friends back in Austin. But Hannah noticed they all kept their voices lower than usual. Something about the silence out here made you want to whisper, like raising your voice would disturb something that should stay sleeping. Around 9 p.m., Chloe stood up to use the bathroom. Bathroom being a euphemism for finding a spot behind some rocks with the camp shovel, the same ritual that campers had performed for thousands of years. She grabbed her headlamp and toilet paper and walked toward the edge of camp, her light bobbing as she moved. She was gone maybe 3 minutes. When she came back, her face was pale even in the warm glow of the camp stove, her eyes wide and spooked. "Did you guys hear that?" Her voice was tight, controlled, like she was trying hard not to sound scared. "Hear what?" Hannah asked. "While I was out there, doing my business." Chloe sat down heavily, her hands shaking slightly. "I heard something, like an owl maybe, but really big, really deep, and it sounded close, like really fucking close, like it was right above me." "Lots of owls in the desert," Ethan said, but he looked uneasy. "Great horned owls, barn owls, elf owls, they're nocturnal hunters." "This didn't sound like those. I've heard owl calls before. This was..." Chloe trailed off, unable to articulate what she meant. "It was wrong, that's the only way I can describe it. The call was wrong." They sat in silence for a moment, listening. The desert night was full of small sounds, wind through the creosote, distant coyote yips and howls, the tick and creak of rocks cooling after the day's heat. But underneath it all, Hannah thought she heard something else. A rustling, like something large moving through brush, trying to be quiet but not quite succeeding. "Probably just a javelina," she said, trying to sound confident even though her own pulse had quickened. "Or a deer. Big Bend has mule deer." But she remembered reading during her research that the park had mountain lions. Not many, not like some parks, but they were there. And mountain lions hunted at night. And they were known to sometimes follow hikers, especially solo hikers, staying just out of sight, waiting for an opportunity. "Let's just go to bed," Derek suggested. He was already standing, stretching, clearly ready to be zipped safely inside a tent. "Early start tomorrow, remember? We want to be hiking by 6 at the latest. Get out before the real heat hits." They cleaned up the dinner gear, brushed their teeth with minimal water, and retreated to their tents. Hannah zipped the mesh door carefully, making sure no gaps where insects could get in. She could hear Derek and Ethan talking quietly in the other tent 20 feet away, their voices a comforting reminder that they weren't alone out here. Well, they weren't alone in their group, but as Hannah lay in her sleeping bag, staring at the tent ceiling, she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something else out here with them, something watching, something waiting. Chloe fell asleep quickly, her breathing evening out into the steady rhythm of deep sleep. But Hannah stayed awake, listening to the desert. She heard the coyotes again, closer this time, their yips and howls echoing off the canyon walls. She heard the wind picking up, rattling the tent fabric. She heard Derek and Ethan's conversation fade into silence as they too fell asleep. And then, maybe an hour after they'd turned in, she heard something else. A whistle. It came from somewhere outside the camp, off in the darkness to the north. Not a bird call, not a coyote, not any natural sound she recognized. It was almost musical, like someone playing a few notes on a flute. 3 notes, descending. Then silence. Then the 3 notes again, slightly closer. Hannah held her breath, listening. Her heartbeat was loud in her ears. Beside her, Chloe stirred but didn't wake. The whistle came again, closer still. And this time, underneath it, Hannah heard something else. A voice, soft, barely audible, speaking in Spanish. Female voice, old, rasping. Ven aquí, niña. Come here. Come here, little girl. Hannah's blood went cold. There was no one else out here. They'd seen no other cars at the trailhead, had encountered no other hikers on the trail. The ranger at the visitor center had confirmed they were the only ones with a permit for this area. And that voice sounded wrong. Too old, too rasping, like vocal cords that hadn't been human for a very long time. She unzipped her sleeping bag as quietly as possible, her hands shaking, and reached for the headlamp. The voice came again, closer, and now it was mixed with that whistle, the 2 sounds woven together in a way that made Hannah's skin crawl. Hannah? Chloe's voice thick with sleep and confusion. What's wrong? Shh. Listen. Do you hear that? They both went perfectly still, listening. For a long moment, there was only the wind and the distant coyotes. Then the whistle came again, and this time it was right outside the tent, maybe 10 feet away, maybe less. Hannah turned on the headlamp, flooding the tent with harsh LED light. In the glow, she could see Chloe's face, pale and frightened, and she could see something else. The mesh door was bulging inward slightly as if something had pressed against it from outside. Hannah could make out the impression of something large, something with a curved shape that could have been a beak or a face, or... The mesh bulged further, and Hannah heard a sound that would haunt her dreams for years afterward. A clicking, like talons tapping on glass, but deeper, more resonant, and underneath it that voice again, no longer whispering. Ven aquí, niña. Sally juega conmigo. Come here, little girl. Come out and play with me. Whatever was pressing against the mesh suddenly pulled back, and Hannah saw it in the split second before it disappeared. A silhouette against the stars. Enormous. Wings spread wide, maybe 15 feet across. The shape of an owl, but far too large, impossibly large, and with something wrong about its outline. Something that suggested it wasn't entirely bird. What the fuck? Chloe whispered, her voice high and tight. What the fuck? What the fuck? What the... Guys! Derek's voice from the other tent, sharp with panic. Something's out here. I can see shadows moving. Hannah made a decision, the kind of split-second choice that changes everything. Everyone get up, get dressed. We're hiking out, right now. In the dark, Ethan protested, his voice muffled through the tent fabric. We can barely see. Now. Right now. Get your boots on. Get your pack. Get your headlamp. We are leaving this camp right now. Maybe if they'd stayed in the tents. Maybe if they'd waited until dawn. Maybe if Hannah had made a different choice in that moment. But she didn't. Because the thing outside was circling them, and some instinct older than reason told her that staying still meant death. They scrambled out of their tents, fumbling in the darkness, headlamps bobbing as they moved. Hannah's hands were shaking so badly she could barely tie her boots. Beside her, Chloe was breathing in short, panicked gasps. Derek and Ethan emerged from their tent, both pale even in the harsh light of the headlamps. What did you see? Derek asked. Something big, something flying. We need to... The whistle came again, and this time it was everywhere at once, surrounding them, above them, in the rocks, in the bushes, in the air itself. And with it came that voice, but now it wasn't speaking Spanish. Now it was speaking English, and it was using their names. Hannah, Derek, don't run. Stay and play. Go, Hannah screamed. They ran. Not organized, not careful, just raw panic flight into the darkness. Their headlamps cut narrow cones of light through the blackness, illuminating rocks and plants and nothing else. Behind them, Hannah could hear something moving, something large, something with wings. She didn't look back. Looking back felt like the last thing she'd ever do. They'd been running maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10. Time had lost all meaning in the panic, when Derek started screaming. "Above us! It's above us!" Hannah looked up and saw it silhouetted against the stars. Enormous, wings spread impossibly wide, gliding silent as death. And as it passed overhead, she saw its face. Human. Almost human. A woman's face, but stretched and distorted, set into an owl's skull that was the size of a car hood. Eyes that reflected their headlamps like mirrors. A mouth that was too wide, full of teeth that no bird should have. It dove. Derek, who was slightly behind the others, raised his hiking pole like a weapon. "Get away from us!" The thing, La Lechuza, Hannah's terrified brain supplied, the owl witch from the stories, grabbed Derek with talons the size of kitchen knives. He screamed, a sound of pure terror and agony as it lifted him. Lifted him like he weighed nothing, like he was a mouse being grabbed by an ordinary owl. "Derek!" Ethan lunged for his friend, managed to grab Derek's ankle. For a moment they were connected. Ethan pulling down, the creature pulling up, Derek screaming between them. Then the creature adjusted its grip and pulled harder, and Derek was gone, lifted up into the darkness, his screams echoing off the canyon walls, growing fainter and fainter until they stopped, until there was only silence. Hannah stood frozen, her headlamp pointing up at the empty sky where Derek had been a moment ago. Beside her, Chloe was sobbing. Ethan had collapsed to his knees, hands over his face. "We need to find shelter," Hannah heard herself say, her voice strange and distant in her own ears. "Something with rocks over it, something it can't get to us." They moved like zombies, no longer running, just stumbling through the darkness. Hannah's mind was blank with shock, unable to process what she'd just seen. Derek was gone. That thing had taken Derek. They found an overhang after what felt like hours, but was probably minutes. A natural shelter formed by layered rock, just barely big enough for the three of them to huddle inside. They crawled in, pressing themselves against the back wall, and turned off their headlamps to save batteries. In the absolute darkness, they waited. They heard it circling, heard the whisper of enormous wings, heard it land on the rocks above them, heard the click of talons on stone, heard it calling to them in voices that sounded like their families, their friends, voices begging them to come out. "Hannah, honey, come out. It's Mom. I'm lost. Please help me." But Hannah's mother was in Houston, safe in her suburban house, probably asleep in her bed. "Chloe, it's your sister. I need you. Please." But Chloe didn't have a sister. "Ethan, come out, man. It's Derek. I'm okay. I need help down here. Come help me." But Derek was gone. Derek was never coming back. They huddled in that rock shelter for hours, until the sky began to lighten, until the sun finally dragged itself above the eastern mountains, until the desert heat returned and drove the thing back to wherever it roosted during the day. When full dawn came, they emerged and found Derek's hiking pole lying in the dirt, snapped in half. Found his bandana, the one he'd been wearing. Found drops of blood on the rocks. They found no body. They started hiking back toward the trailhead, moving as fast as their exhausted legs would carry them. They finished all their water before they were halfway there. By the time they collapsed in the thin shade of a boulder 2 miles from the parking lot, they were severely dehydrated, sunburned, and broken in ways that had nothing to do with their physical state. That's where Marcus and Elena found them. The sun was merciless as Marcus and Elena hiked the 3 survivors back to the trailhead. They moved slowly, carefully, making frequent water breaks. Hannah, Chloe, and Ethan were in bad shape. Dehydrated, sun-damaged, clearly traumatized. They barely spoke except to answer direct questions. Marcus called in the helicopter evacuation from the parking lot, and they waited in the shade of the Jeep until the medical team arrived. While they waited, Marcus tried to get information about Derek. "He was with us last night," Hannah said, her voice flat and mechanical. "We were camping. Something attacked us. It took him." "What kind of something?" Elena pressed gently. Hannah just shook her head, tears streaming down her sunburned face. You won't believe me. Try us. So Hannah told them. About the whistle, about the voice speaking Spanish, about the enormous owl thing with a human face, about how it had grabbed Derek and flown away with him, about how they'd heard his screams fade into nothing. Marcus exchanged a glance with Elena. She looked grim but not surprised. We'll mount a search, Elena said. Full recovery operation. If your friend is out there, we'll find him. But her expression told Marcus what she really thought. They wouldn't find Derek Walsh. Not alive. Maybe not at all. The helicopter arrived 20 minutes later, the rotors beating the hot air into submission. Paramedics loaded the 3 survivors onto stretchers, started IVs, began treating them for severe dehydration and exposure. Marcus stood back, watching them being lifted away, and tried to process what Hannah had told him. La Lechuza, the owl witch. The thing Esteban Morales had warned him about that very morning. We're going back out, Elena said, checking her GPS. We need to document the campsite, look for any sign of Walsh. They hiked back in, following the trail and then the drag marks and scattered gear that marked where the group had fled. They found the abandoned campsite first. Tents shredded, sleeping bags torn, food bags still hanging untouched. Then they followed the path of destruction through the brush, finding pieces of gear, drops of blood, and finally, Derek's broken hiking pole. What they didn't find was Derek. They searched for hours, calling his name, checking every gully and rock formation within a mile radius. Elena photographed everything. The enormous talon prints in the dirt, the claw marks on the rocks, the blood spatter that suggested violence. By the time they hiked back out, it was late afternoon and Marcus's radio had been silent for hours. No cell signal this deep in the park, no way to call for backup or update. They were on their own. At the trailhead, Marcus checked his messages and found texts from the hospital where Hannah, Chloe, and Ethan had been taken. All 3 were being treated and would survive physically. Psychologically was another question. His phone buzzed with a new message as he was reading the others. Unknown number. This is Esteban Morales. I told you this morning. The young man who is missing, the Park Service won't find him. But I know where to look. Meet me at Castellon Historical District at sunrise tomorrow if you want the truth. Marcus stared at the text for a long time before responding. I'll be there. Acurici. Sunrise came hot and harsh, the sun aggressive from the moment it cleared the mountains. Marcus had barely slept, had lain awake in his trailer listening to every sound, jumping at shadows. He drove to Castellon in the pre-dawn darkness, arrived just as the sky was turning from black to deep blue. Esteban was waiting in the parking lot, sitting in the cab of his old Ford pickup. Marcus parked and walked over, every step feeling significant, like he was crossing some threshold he couldn't come back from. Get in, Esteban said. We don't have much time before it gets too hot to be out here safely. Marcus climbed into the passenger seat. The truck's interior smelled like coffee and old leather and something else. Sage, maybe, or copal incense. Where are we going? You want to understand what you're dealing with. You need to see where it nests, where it takes what it kills. Esteban started the engine. But I need you to promise me something first. What you're about to see, you don't report it, not officially. You take photographs if you need to. But the Park Service doesn't send teams out there, doesn't make it official. Understand? Why not? Because some things are better left alone. Because you start poking around its nest, it might decide to hunt more actively. Might decide to hunt you specifically. Esteban fixed Marcus with a hard stare. Your grandmother understood this. There are some battles you don't pick because you can't win them. The best you can do is warn people and hope they listen. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist there had to be a way to stop this thing, to kill it, to make the park safe. But looking at Esteban's weathered face, at eyes that had seen more desert than Marcus could imagine, he knew the old man was right. I promise, Marcus said quietly. They drove on increasingly rough roads, finally parking where the road ended and the real desert began. Esteban led the way on foot, moving with surprising speed for a man his age. They hiked for maybe 2 miles, the sun climbing, the temperature already past 90 degrees even at 7 a.m. Then Esteban stopped, pointing at a rock formation ahead. Tall spires weathered by millennia of wind and water into shapes that looked almost architectural, almost deliberately shaped. There, that's where it roosts during the day. The formation rose maybe 100 feet, with numerous cracks and overhangs where a large bird could shelter from the sun. And at the base, in a cave-like depression, Marcus saw them. Bones. Human bones. Dozens of them, scattered and broken and sun-bleached white. Skulls with marks that looked like talon gouges, rib cages crushed, femurs snapped. Remains that had been here for days or weeks or years, picked clean by the sun and scavengers. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed. It's been hunting here for a long time, Esteban said quietly. My grandfather knew about it. His grandfather before him. The rangers don't talk about it because who would believe them? But we know. Those of us who live on the border who understand that some things are older than laws and borders and rational explanations. Marcus pulled out his phone, hands shaking, and started taking photographs. Evidence. Proof. Though proof of what, he wasn't entirely sure. That a monster was real? That the stories were true? You won't find your missing hiker here, Esteban continued. It drops the bones when it's done. Could be anywhere in 50 square miles. Desert scavengers will have scattered what's left. In a week, there won't be anything to find. There has to be a way to stop it. To kill it. Marcus's voice came out harder than he'd intended. Anger mixing with grief for a young man he'd never met. Esteban looked at him with something like pity. You kill this one, another takes its place. That's how curses work, mijo. The thing wearing the owl shape isn't the problem. The curse itself is the problem. The hunger that never dies, that gets passed from one witch to the next, that's been hunting these borderlands for longer than anyone remembers. You don't break a curse that old without paying a price yourself. Usually a price too high to be worth it. So we just let it keep hunting? Keep killing? No, we warn people. Keep them off the trails after dark, especially during the new moon. Make sure they understand the desert isn't safe, isn't tame, isn't just another place to take selfies and post on Instagram. Esteban turned away from the bone field. That's all we can do. That's all anyone's ever been able to do. They hiked back in silence. Marcus's mind was racing, trying to process what he'd seen, what it meant, what he was supposed to do with this information. Report it and be laughed at, stay silent and live with the knowledge that something was out there hunting, and people were going to die. At the truck, Esteban turned to him. Your grandmother was smart because she respected what she didn't understand. You want to last out here, you do the same. Except that some things can't be explained, can't be stopped. Only survived. Marcus drove back to Panther Junction alone, those words echoing in his head. Except that some things can only be survived. Not defeated, not conquered, not controlled. Just survived. He'd thought being a ranger meant protecting people, keeping them safe. But out here in Big Bend, in the desert that remembered everything, maybe the best you could do was warn them, and hope they listened before it was too late. McDuntabustard and the search for Derek Walsh officially began that afternoon with a full team. Search and rescue from 3 counties, cadaver dogs, drone operators, all the technology modern search efforts could provide. Marcus participated, hiking back to the area where Hannah said Derek had been taken, helping to establish a grid search pattern. They found nothing that first day, or the second, or the third. On day 4, the dogs hit on something near the confluence where the group had been camping. Everyone's hopes rose. Maybe they'd finally found him. Maybe there would be closure for his family. But when they excavated the area, all they found were bones. Old bones, decades old at least, from someone who'd gone missing long before Derek Walsh was even born. More bones in the desert. More proof that La Lechuza had been hunting here for a very long time. The search continued for 8 days total. They combed every canyon and gully within a 10-mile radius. They used thermal imaging drones, cadaver dogs, ground-penetrating radar. They found nothing except more old bones in places bones shouldn't be, more evidence of deaths that had never been officially recorded. On day 9, the search was officially suspended. Derek Walsh was declared missing, presumed dead. The official report cited Suspected large predator attack, possibly mountain lion, without any real evidence to support that conclusion. Just the need to write something that wouldn't make the Park Service look incompetent or crazy. Marcus filed supplementary reports containing witness statements about an owl-like entity of unusual size. He attached his photographs of the bone field, the talon prints, the claw marks. He documented everything carefully, professionally, knowing that someone in some office would read it and then file it away under unsolved anomalies and never think about it again. Hannah, Chloe, and Ethan were released from the hospital after 3 days of treatment. None of them would talk to the media beyond a prepared statement. None of them would return Marcus's calls when he tried to reach out for additional information. He understood. He was a reminder of the worst night of their lives, of watching their friend die in the most horrific way imaginable. Better to pretend he didn't exist. Marcus went back to work because he had no choice. His transfer request had been denied. Budget cuts, personnel shortages, all the usual bureaucratic excuses. He was stuck at Big Bend, at least for now. So he greeted visitors, answered questions about trail conditions and camping permits, led educational talks about desert ecology and wildlife. But everything felt different now. The desert wasn't just beautiful and dangerous in the normal ways. It was actively malevolent in ways he couldn't admit to anyone except Elena and Esteban. It had teeth and wings and hunger, and it remembered everyone who'd seen it. 3 weeks after the incident, Marcus was closing up the visitor center at 10 p.m. after a late shift. He was alone, the parking lot empty, the desert dark beyond the reach of the exterior lights. He was locking the front door when he heard it. Whistling. 3 descending notes, musical and wrong, coming from the darkness beyond the parking lot. Marcus froze, his hand on the door handle, every instinct screaming at him to get inside. Lock the door, turn on every light, call Elena, call someone, do anything except stand here exposed and vulnerable. The whistling came again, closer, and then a voice speaking in Spanish, in an accent that sounded exactly like his grandmother's. That remembered voice from childhood that had told him stories and warned him about the desert. Marcus, mijo, ven aquí. Tu abuela te llama. Marcus, my son, come here, your grandmother calls you. His grandmother had been dead for 5 years. Marcus lunged inside, slammed the door, locked it with shaking hands. He turned on every light in the building, every single switch, flooding the visitor center with harsh fluorescent brightness that pushed back the dark. He called Elena on his cell, his voice probably too high, too panicked, but he didn't care. Elena, it's here, at the station. I can hear it. I'm coming. 20 minutes. Stay inside, stay in the light, don't look out the windows. Marcus hung up and stood in the middle of the visitor center, surrounded by educational displays about geology and wildlife, and tried not to think about what was outside. Tried not to hear the whistling that continued for another 10 minutes, circling the building. Tried not to hear his grandmother's voice calling his name. Elena arrived with Esteban 30 minutes later. She'd called him on the way, and they'd met up before driving to Panther Junction. The 3 of them stayed in the visitor center until sunrise, taking turns keeping watch, jumping at every sound. The whistling eventually stopped, but none of them slept. It knows you now, Esteban said quietly, around 3 a.m., sitting in a chair by the window, looking out at the darkness. Knows your name, knows your voice, probably knows where you live. That's how it works. Once it marks you, you're never really safe again. My grandfather told me about a ranger back in the 60s after Big Bend became a national park. He saw it too, heard it calling him, refused to transfer, thought he could tough it out, thought he was smarter than some old legend. What happened to him? Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. They found his truck on the Ross Maxwell Scenic Drive, door open, keys in the ignition, radio still on. Never found him. Just the truck and some blood on the seat. Esteban turned to look at Marcus. He'd been here 3 years, knew the park like his own backyard. Didn't matter. The Lechuza is patient. It waited until he got careless, until he thought maybe he was safe after all. Then it took him. So what do I do? Marcus's voice came out smaller than he'd intended, like a child asking an adult for protection from monsters under the bed. You don't go out alone at night. Period. Not to your car, not to check on something, not for any reason. You don't answer voices in the dark, no matter how familiar they sound, no matter who they claim to be. And you don't try to hunt it, because you'll lose. Every single time. Esteban paused. And you apply for that transfer again. Keep applying. Eventually they'll approve it, and you get out of Big Bend before you become another missing person report. Marcus wanted to argue, wanted to insist there had to be some way to fight back, to protect people, to do the job he'd signed up for, but he'd seen those bones. He'd heard his grandmother's voice coming from something that wasn't his grandmother. He knew he was outmatched. I'll keep applying, he said finally. The sun came up hot and harsh, as it always did, and the three of them emerged from the visitor center into a morning that looked perfectly normal. Blue sky, rising heat, desert stretching to the horizon. No sign of anything wrong. No evidence that something had been hunting in the darkness just hours before, but Marcus knew better now. He knew that the desert had layers, had depths that most people never saw, and he knew that some of those depths had teeth. 4 months later, in late September when the heat finally broke and tourists started returning to Big Bend in larger numbers, a hiker reported finding bones in a canyon 15 miles from the Dodson Trail. Marcus was part of the recovery team. He hiked out there with Elena and 2 other rangers following the hikers' GPS coordinates. What they found was scattered across maybe 50 yards. Bones, weathered clothing, a wallet with Derek Walsh's ID still inside. The forensics report would later note, massive trauma consistent with a large avian predator, and conclude that no known North American bird species could cause that level of damage. The report would note this discrepancy and offer no explanation, because there was no explanation that would fit in an official document. Derek Walsh's family buried an empty coffin because there wasn't enough of him left to bury. Marcus attended the memorial service in Austin on his day off. Hannah, Chloe, and Ethan were there. They saw him, recognized him from his uniform even though he was wearing civilian clothes, and turned away. He understood. He was a reminder of the worst night of their lives, of the moment their world stopped making sense. He didn't try to talk to them, just paid his respects and left. He drove back to Big Bend alone, arrived after dark because he'd stayed too long at the service, and as he pulled into the ranger station parking lot, he saw something perched on the roof of the visitor center. A shape. Massive. Hunched. When his headlights hit it, it spread wings that had to be 15 feet across, maybe more. For just a moment before it lifted into the air and disappeared into the darkness, Marcus saw its face. Human eyes in an owl's skull. A mouth that was too wide, too full of teeth that no bird should have. And it was smiling. It made that whistling sound as it flew away. 3 descending notes that echoed across the empty desert. A sound that Marcus would hear in his dreams for years to come. Maybe for the rest of his life. He sat in his truck, engine still running, hands shaking on the steering wheel. He could leave. Could request that transfer again, insist on it, refuse to take no for an answer. Could leave Big Bend and never come back, let some other ranger deal with this nightmare. But Esteban's words kept echoing in his mind. Once it marks you, you're never really safe again. There was no leaving. No escape. The thing in the desert knew his name, knew his voice, knew where he lived and worked. It had marked him, claimed him, and geography wouldn't change that. He could run to Alaska or Florida or Maine, and it would still remember him, would still call his name in the darkness. All he could do was survive. One night at a time, one shift at a time. So Marcus got out of the truck, walked to his trailer, unlocked the door. Inside, he turned on every light and checked every window, made sure they were all locked, made sure nothing could get in. He brewed coffee even though it was late, needing something to do with his hands, needing the ritual of normal tasks to convince himself the world still made sense. And every night after that, when darkness fell over the Chihuahuan desert, Marcus listened for the whistle. Listened for his name called in voices that should be silent. His grandmother, his mother, friends from college, voices of people who were hundreds of miles away or years dead. Listened for the rush of enormous wings in the darkness outside his windows. And he never ever went outside after dark. Not alone. Not even to his truck. Not even for the 30 seconds it would take to get from his trailer to the visitor center. Because 30 seconds was all it would need. Marcus still works at Big Bend. His transfer requests keep getting denied. Always a reason, always a justification, always the same result. He's been there for 8 months now, and he's learned to live with the fear. The way soldiers learn to live with the sound of distant gunfire. It becomes background noise, a constant low hum of awareness that never quite goes away. He warns visitors, tells them to be off the trails before dark, to camp only in designated areas with other people, to never hike alone. Most of them smile and nod and ignore him, thinking he's just another overly cautious ranger. But some, the ones who listen carefully, who hear something in his voice that speaks of real experience, real fear, those ones follow his advice. Those are the ones who make it back. Late at night, when he can't sleep, Marcus sometimes drives to the edge of the park and looks out at the desert. Thousands of square miles of emptiness, of rock and sand and darkness, and he knows that somewhere out there, something is looking back. Something with wings and talons and a human face. Something that knows his name and is waiting, patient as stone for the moment when his guard drops or his fear fades or he simply forgets why he should be afraid. That day will come eventually. Marcus knows that. Everyone gets careless eventually. He just hopes it's not tonight. Incident Report. National Park Service Case. Big 2019-0528 M status. Closed subject. Walsh, Derek, Dobb, 03-15-1993. Last known location, Dodson Trail, Big Bend National Park. TX dates, May 28 to 29, 2019. Summary. Subject was part of 4-person hiking party that encountered large predator during overnight camping expedition. 3 members of party survived and were evacuated with severe dehydration, sun exposure, and psychological trauma. Subject's remains were recovered September 12, 2019, approximately 15 miles from group's last known campsite. Forensic analysis indicates death by massive trauma, consistent with large avian predator. Species cannot be definitively determined from available evidence. Case classified as accidental death due to animal attack. Witness statements. Surviving party members described predator as extremely large owl-like entity. Details deemed unreliable due to extreme stress, darkness, and distance. No physical evidence supports described size estimates. More probable explanation: large golden eagle or other known raptor species. Appearance exaggerated by trauma response. Physical evidence: large talon marks found at campsite and along presumed attack route. Claw marks on rock surfaces consistent with large bird. Subjects' hiking equipment recovered in scattered locations. Partial remains showing trauma patterns consistent with raptor predation. Historical bone deposits found in area dating back multiple decades. Recommendations: enhanced warning signage at Dodson Trail and other remote backcountry areas regarding nighttime predator activity. Mandatory: check-in protocols for overnight hikers during high-risk periods. New moon, isolated areas. Increased ranger patrol frequency in affected zones. Updated visitor education materials regarding wildlife safety. Supplementary notes. Lead Ranger M. Rivera filed additional documentation containing expanded witness statements and photographic evidence of anomalous predator signs. Material reviewed and filed for reference but deemed non-material to official finding. Local rancher reports of livestock losses in adjacent areas corroborate presence of large unidentified predator. Park Service does not have resources or jurisdiction to mount active predator control operation at this time. Enhanced visitor education and area restrictions deemed sufficient response. Multiple historical disappearances in same general area noted dating back to 1987. Pattern suggests long-term predator presence, Possibly generational. Eagle-hawk nesting site. Recommend long-term monitoring. Case closed pending new evidence. File sealed. Location: Big Bend National Park, Texas. Date: June 8, 2019. James Hartley had exactly 7 days left. 7 days until retirement. 7 days until he could leave Big Bend behind and never think about it again. 7 days until he could trade the Chihuahuan Desert for a fishing cabin in East Texas, where the only thing he'd have to worry about was whether the crappie were biting. He stood on the porch of the Chisos Basin Ranger Station, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over the mountains. The sky was already bleaching from deep purple to pale blue, and he could feel the heat building even at 6 in the morning. June in Big Bend meant triple-digit temperatures by noon, the kind of dry, relentless heat that could kill the unprepared in hours. James had spent 27 years learning to respect that heat, learning every trail and canyon and water source in this 500,000-acre park that straddled the Rio Grande. 27 years was long enough. The coffee was terrible, bitter and over-extracted the way government-issue coffee always tasted. But James drank it anyway. Habit, routine, the same routine he'd followed for nearly 3 decades. Wake at 5:30, brew coffee, watch the sunrise, check the weather station, review the overnight reports, plan the day's patrols. This morning's weather was predictable. Clear skies, high of 107 degrees, low tonight around 77 degrees. No rain in the forecast. There never was. Big Bend averaged less than 10 inches of precipitation a year, most of it falling in brief, violent thunderstorms that sent flash floods tearing through the canyons. But not today. Today would be clear and hot and merciless. James finished his coffee and went inside to check the reports. The station was quiet this early. Sarah wouldn't arrive until 8, and Miguel was up at Persimmon Gap doing entrance station duty. James had the place to himself, which suited him fine. He'd always preferred working alone, especially these last few years. Less small talk, less having to pretend he gave a damn about whatever new initiative the superintendent was pushing. He sat down at the desk and pulled up the overnight incident log on the computer. Standard stuff, mostly. A medical assist at one of the campgrounds, dehydration, treated and released. A locked keys and car call, resolved. 2 reports of suspicious wildlife behavior. James paused on that last one. 2 separate reports, both from the Chisos Basin campground, both filed around 11 p.m. last night. Campers reporting unusual owl activity. Multiple large owls circling the campground, making strange vocalizations, approaching closer to tense than normal owl behavior would suggest. James frowned. Big Bend had healthy populations of great horned owls, western screech owls, and elf owls. Owls were nocturnal hunters. They hunted rodents, snakes, insects. They didn't circle campgrounds or approach tents. They avoided humans. He pulled up the full reports. The first was from a family in Site 47. Large owl, maybe 3 to 4 feet tall, kept landing on trees near our tent, made weird crying sounds, not normal hooting. Almost sounded like a woman crying. Kids were scared. Owl left around midnight. The second report was from a solo camper in Site 63. Woke up around 11:30 p.m. to see huge owl perched on my picnic table, maybe 10 feet from tent. Biggest owl I've ever seen. Eyes reflected my headlamp bright yellow. It stared at me for a long time, didn't fly away when I yelled. Finally left when I threw a rock near it. Unnerving. James sat back in his chair. In 27 years, he'd dealt with just about every kind of wildlife situation imaginable. Black bears getting into coolers, mountain lions stalking joggers, javelinas charging photographers who got too close. He'd even dealt with a rabid fox once back in '98. But owls behaving aggressively toward humans? That was new. Probably nothing. Maybe a nesting site nearby and the parent owls were being territorial. Or maybe, more likely, tourists who didn't know the difference between an owl and a nighthawk, who jumped at every shadow and sound in the desert dark. City people weren't comfortable with real wilderness. They came out here expecting Disneyland with cacti and got upset when nature refused to behave. Still, 2 reports in one night. Same behavior, same campground. James made a note to patrol the Chisos Basin this morning, check for nests, maybe post some informational signs about owl behavior, cover his bases. Last thing he needed in his final week was some lawsuit because an owl scared someone's kid and he'd failed to investigate. He printed out the reports, grabbed his gear, and headed for his truck. The drive up to Chisos Basin took 20 minutes, climbing from the desert floor into the mountains through a series of steep switchbacks. James had driven this road 10,000 times, knew every curve and pothole, could probably do it blindfolded. The landscape changed as he climbed, Ocotillo and Lechuguilla giving way to piñon pine and juniper, the temperature dropping a few merciful degrees. The Chisos Basin was a natural bowl in the mountains, surrounded by peaks that rose over 7,000 feet. It was the most popular area of the park, campground, lodge, trailhead access to high country hikes. During peak season it was packed, but this was June, the brutal dead of summer, and only the hardcore desert rats and international tourists were crazy enough to visit now. James parked at the campground entrance and started walking the loops. The sites were maybe a third full, a handful of tents, a few RVs, one vintage Airstream that probably cost more than James's annual salary. Most campers were still asleep, smart enough to wait for the worst of the heat to pass before starting their day. Site 47 was occupied by the family from the report, a couple in their 30s with 2 young kids, Colorado plates on their Subaru. The father was up, making coffee on a camp stove. He looked tired. "Morning," James called out, keeping his voice low. "Ranger Hartley, got your report about the owl activity last night. Mind if I ask you a few questions?" The man looked relieved to see him. "Yeah, absolutely. That was really weird. I've been camping my whole life, never seen an owl act like that. Tell me what you saw." "We were getting ready for bed, maybe 10:45 or so. I heard the sound, kind of like crying, but not quite. My wife thought it was a coyote at first. Then we saw it land in that tree." He pointed to a piñon pine about 30 feet from the tent. Huge owl. I mean, really big. At least 3 feet tall, maybe more. It just sat there, staring at our tent, making that crying sound. "Did it have ear tufts? Like horns on its head?" "Yeah, I think so. Hard to tell in the dark." Great horned owl, then. They were large, up to 2 feet tall, occasionally larger, but 3 feet was pushing it. People always overestimated size in the dark, though. Fear made everything bigger. "How long did it stay?" "Over an hour, just sitting there, watching. I tried to scare it off a few times, but it wouldn't budge. My daughter was crying, said it was looking at her. And the sound it made..." The man shook his head. "It really did sound like a woman crying, not hooting, crying." James made notes on his clipboard. "Did it make any aggressive moves? Try to attack or approach closer?" "No, nothing like that. It just watched. Finally, around midnight, it flew off. But then..." The man hesitated. "This is going to sound crazy. Try me. I swear I heard it land on the roof of our tent, like I could feel the weight of it. My wife heard it too. We were both lying there, frozen, listening to this thing walking around on top of the tent. But when I looked outside, nothing was there. No owl, no footprints in the dust. Nothing." James kept his expression neutral. Sometimes wind can create unusual sounds against tent fabric, or maybe a branch fell. There was no wind last night, and I know what I heard. The man crossed his arms. "Look, I'm not some paranoid city slicker. I know the difference between an animal and my imagination. Something was on our tent, and whatever it wasn't natural. Okay?" James closed his notebook. "I'm going to check the area, look for nests or signs of unusual owl activity. In the meantime, keep your food properly stored, don't leave trash out, and if you see the owl again, don't approach it. Get video if you can from a safe distance. We're leaving today anyway. My wife wants to go to Carlsbad Caverns instead. She says this place has a bad feeling." James had heard that before. Some people felt it, especially in the more remote areas of Big Bend. A sense of age, of something watching. of territory that had been sacred to indigenous peoples long before it became a national park, and still carried that weight. James had never felt it himself. To him, Big Bend was just geology and biology, heat and stone. Beautiful, sure. Harsh, absolutely. But not supernatural. Never supernatural. He checked Site 63 next. The solo camper, a man in his 50s with a Canadian accent and expensive photography gear, told a similar story. Large owl, prolonged staring, unusual vocalizations, eventually flew away. No physical aggression, just deeply unnerving behavior. "I've photographed wildlife all over the world," the Canadian said. "I know predator behavior. That owl wasn't hunting. It was assessing, like it was deciding whether I was worth the trouble." "Worth the trouble for what?" The man gave him a long look. "You tell me, Ranger." James spent 2 hours searching the area around the campground. He found old owl pellets beneath several trees. Normal, showed owls were hunting rodents. He found what might have been roosting sites, but he found no active nests, no signs of territorial behavior, nothing that would explain why owls would be harassing campers. The heat was building now, the sun a white hammer on the back of his neck. James retreated to his truck and cranked the AC. He sat there for a few minutes thinking. 27 years in wilderness management had taught James that almost everything had a rational explanation. Mysterious lights, swamp gas or headlights reflecting off atmospheric conditions, strange sounds in the forest, tree branches rubbing, rocks falling, foxes screaming, animals acting weird, disease, habitat disruption, human food conditioning. There was always an explanation, always. But something about this bothered him. 2 experienced campers, both describing the same unusual behavior, both mentioning the crying sound, both using the word unnatural. James pulled out his phone and did something he rarely did. He Googled it. Owl crying sound Texas folklore. The results that came back made him pause. Lechuza, La Lechuza, the owl witch. James clicked through several articles on Texas Mexican folklore. The story was consistent across sources. A lechuza was a bruja, a witch, who could transform into a giant owl with the face of a woman. It hunted at night, crying like a woman in distress to lure victims. In some versions, it was a witch seeking revenge. In others, it was the ghost of a woman who died tragically. The stories went back centuries, brought north from Mexico, woven into the folklore of South Texas and the borderlands. If you heard La Lechuza crying, it meant death was coming. If it landed on your roof, someone in your family would die within a week. If you saw its face, the face of a woman on the body of an enormous owl, you were already marked for death. James closed the browser, feeling vaguely embarrassed. Folklore, superstition, stories people told to explain natural phenomena they didn't understand or to scare children into behaving. He'd grown up in West Texas, heard all the local legends, Chupacabra, La Llorona, ghost lights in Marfa. None of it was real. All of it had rational explanations if you bothered to look. But he couldn't shake the memory of the Canadian's words. That owl wasn't hunting, it was assessing. James radioed dispatch. Unit 6 to base. "Go ahead, Unit 6. Sarah's voice, bright and efficient. She'd started her shift. "I'm at Chizos Base and followed up on the owl reports from last night. Both campers described similar behavior. Large owl, prolonged observation, unusual vocalizations. No signs of nests or obvious territorial cause. Requesting we add a note to the campground host briefing about possible owl activity, advise campers to secure food, and avoid leaving pets unattended." "Copy that. Anything else?" James hesitated. Then, "Has there been any pattern of owl reports recently? Last few weeks or months?" A pause. Then Sarah's voice came back, curious. "Actually, yeah. Now that you mention it, I've seen several reports. Mostly from the backcountry sites. Campers reporting owls circling campsites making weird sounds. I figured it was just tourist overreaction. You know how they get." "How many reports?" "Maybe 6 or 7 in the last month. All different locations. Chizos Basin, Pine Canyon, Ernst Tinaja, Paint Gap. All nocturnal. All describing large owls acting unusual. 7 reports. All in the last month. All describing the same behavior. Send me the details on those reports, James said. I want to review them. Sure thing. Everything okay? Yeah. Just being thorough. Unit 6 clear. James sat in his truck, AC blasting, staring out at the mountains. 7 days until retirement. 7 days until he could walk away from this place and never think about it again. He should leave it alone. File the report, post the warnings, let someone else figure it out. It wasn't his problem anymore. But 27 years of being a good ranger, of doing the job right, of caring about the people who visited this park, that didn't just turn off because he had a retirement date circled on a calendar. James put the truck in gear and headed back down the mountain. Tyler Morrison was having the best week of his life. He'd graduated from UT Austin 3 weeks ago with a degree in environmental science. His college girlfriend had just agreed to move to Colorado with him in August. He had a job lined up with the Forest Service starting in September. And right now, at this exact moment, he was hiking into one of the most remote and beautiful places in Texas, with 3 days of backcountry solitude ahead of him. Life was good. The trail to Pine Canyon was only 4 miles, but it climbed steadily through a rugged landscape of volcanic rock and desert scrub. Tyler was in good shape. He ran marathons, spent weekends climbing at Reimer's Ranch. But the heat was brutal even at 9 in the morning. He'd already gone through half of one water bottle, and he could feel sweat soaking through his shirt. He didn't care. This was why he'd gone into environmental science in the first place. To spend time in places like this. Wild places. Real places. Not stuck in some office writing reports nobody would read. The permit system for Pine Canyon only allowed 2 parties per night, and according to the ranger at the permit desk, Tyler was the only one booked for the next 3 nights. Total solitude. No crowds, no cell service, no distractions. Just him and the desert and the stars. Perfect. Tyler reached the canyon entrance around 11. The trail narrowed here, winding between high walls of volcanic tuff carved by millions of years of erosion. The temperature dropped slightly in the shade, a blessed relief. The canyon was beautiful. Layers of pink and orange stone, vegetation clinging to impossible angles, a seasonal creek bed that was bone dry this time of year. He found the campsite another mile in, a flat area beneath a cluster of cottonwood trees, with a stone fire ring and a bear box for food storage. The box was technically for bears, but the real threat here was javelinas and ringtails getting into supplies. Tyler had read all the literature, done his research. He knew how to camp in Big Bend. He set up his tent, stored his food properly, filtered water from the spring 100 yards upstream. By noon, the temperature was pushing 105 degrees Fahrenheit, so Tyler retreated to the shade and dozed, reading a paperback thriller until the worst of the heat passed. The afternoon was quiet. He saw a few lizards, heard the distant call of a canyon wren. Around 6 p.m. he made dinner, dehydrated pasta that tasted better than it had any right to after a day of hiking, and watched the light change on the canyon walls. This was what he'd been missing, what he'd been craving. Cities were fine, people were fine, but this silence, this vastness, this sense of being a tiny part of something much larger, this was what filled the hollow places inside him. As the sun set, Tyler started a small fire in the ring and sat watching the stars emerge. The sky in Big Bend was incredible, so far from any light pollution that the Milky Way looked like a river of light overhead. He stayed up late, drinking instant coffee, making notes in his journal about things he wanted to remember. Around 11 p.m., he heard the first cry. It was distant somewhere up canyon, a long, mournful sound that rose and fell. Tyler's first thought was a coyote. They made all kinds of weird vocalizations, but this didn't sound like any coyote he'd heard. It sounded almost human, almost like someone crying. He listened, trying to place it. Another cry, closer this time. Definitely not a coyote. Maybe a mountain lion? He'd read they could make sounds that resembled human screams. Tyler added wood to the fire, making it brighter. Predators avoided fire. That was Wilderness 101. The crying sound came again. Much closer now. Maybe 100 yards away, up the canyon wall. Tyler grabbed his headlamp and aimed it toward the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating rock and brush. Nothing moved. The crying stopped. He waited, listening. 5 minutes passed. 10. Nothing. Probably just his imagination working overtime. Or an owl. Great horned owls made all kinds of weird sounds. This was their territory. He was the intruder. Tyler banked the fire and retreated to his tent, zipping the door completely closed. He lay in his sleeping bag, listening to the night sounds of the desert. Wind through the canyon. Insects. The settling creak of cooling rock. And then, very clearly, very close. Footsteps. Not paw steps, not the scrabbling of claws. Footsteps, two-legged footsteps, walking around the perimeter of his campsite. Tyler's heart hammered. There were no other campers. He checked the permit board. He was alone out here. Hello? His voice sounded thin, pathetic. Is someone there? The footsteps stopped. Silence. Tyler lay frozen in the dark, every muscle tense, straining to hear. Minutes passed. Nothing. He was being paranoid, working himself up over nothing. This was what happened when you camped alone in an unfamiliar place. Every sound became a threat. Every shadow became a monster. It was just adrenaline and darkness playing tricks. Tyler forced himself to breathe slowly to relax. He was fine. Everything was fine. And then something landed on the roof of his tent with enough force to make the poles flex. Tyler stopped breathing entirely. He could feel the weight of something large pressing down on the fabric above his head. Could hear the scrape of what might have been claws or talons against nylon. Whatever was on his tent was heavy. And it was moving, shifting position, walking slowly from one end to the other. Tyler's hand crept toward the bear spray in the pocket of his tent. His fingers closed around the canister. The weight moved again, settling directly above where he lay. And then it made a sound. Not a bird sound, not an animal sound, a human sound. A woman's voice speaking from inches above his face, separated only by a thin layer of fabric. "Por qué estás aquí?" Tyler nearly screamed. The voice was wrong, too deep, too resonant, like it was coming from a chest cavity too large. And he didn't speak Spanish, but he understood the tone. Accusation, anger, warning. I'm just camping," Tyler stammered. "I have a permit. I'm not..." The voice cut him off, switching to English with an accent he couldn't place. "You should not be here. This place is not for you. Who are you? What do you want?" No answer. The weight on the tent shifted, moved toward the door. Tyler heard the zipper begin to move, sliding down, one tooth at a time, opening the tent from the outside. Tyler exploded into action. He lunged for the door, grabbed the zipper from inside, held it closed with all his strength. On the other side, something pulled harder. The fabric strained. The zipper teeth began to separate. "Get away from me," Tyler shouted. He grabbed his headlamp, clicked it to full brightness, aimed it at the door. The pulling stopped immediately. Tyler stayed frozen, breathing hard, holding the zipper closed. Seconds stretched into minutes. Whatever had been there was gone. He could feel the absence of its weight, hear the silence where its presence had been. Slowly, carefully, Tyler aimed his headlamp around the tent, checking every corner. No shadows, no movement, no impossible things trying to get inside. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. He sat with his back against the tent wall, headlamp on, bear spray in hand, listening to every sound the desert made, waiting for the thing to come back. But it didn't. As the eastern sky began to lighten toward dawn, the night sounds faded. Birds began to sing. The temperature started to climb. Normal sounds, normal light, normal world. Tyler emerged from the tent as soon as there was enough light to see. His campsite looked exactly as he'd left it. No footprints in the dust, No claw marks on the tent fabric. No evidence that anything unusual had happened. But Tyler knew what he'd experienced, knew what he'd heard. He broke camp in 20 minutes, shoved everything into his pack, didn't bother with breakfast. He needed to get out of this canyon. Needed to get back to the ranger station. Needed to report what had happened. As he hiked out, moving fast, Tyler kept looking over his shoulder. The canyon walls seemed taller now, more oppressive. The shadows seemed deeper. And once, glancing up at the canyon rim, he thought he saw a shape perched on the edge, large and dark and watching. But when he looked again, it was gone. James was doing paperwork, the last thing he wanted to do in his final week, when the radio crackled to life. Base to Unit 6, we have a walk-in at the visitor center. Solo backpacker from Pine Canyon says he needs to report an incident. He's pretty shaken up. James sighed. Copy. I'll head over. He found Tyler Morrison sitting on a bench outside the visitor center, looking exhausted and pale despite his obvious fitness. The kid, because that's what he was, couldn't be more than 22 or 23, clutched a water bottle like a lifeline. Mr. Morrison? I'm Ranger Hartley. I understand you had an incident at Pine Canyon. Tyler looked up at him with eyes that had seen something they didn't want to talk about. James recognized that look. He'd seen it before, on people who'd had close calls with mountain lions or gotten lost in the backcountry for days. Something was in my camp last night, something that wasn't human. James sat down beside him, pulled out his notebook. Tell me what happened. Tyler did. All of it. The crying sounds, the footsteps, the weight on his tent, the voice speaking Spanish and English, the thing trying to unzip his tent from outside. James listened without interrupting, taking careful notes. When Tyler finished, he was quiet for a moment, thinking. Did you see what it was? Get a visual? No, it was too dark, and I was too scared to look outside. But I heard it. I felt it. And Ranger, I'm telling you, that wasn't a bear or a mountain lion or any animal. It was something else. Let me ask you something. The voice you heard, could it have been another camper? Maybe someone who didn't have a permit was camping illegally? There was no one else. I checked the permit board, and no person could have gotten on top of my tent like that. The way it moved. Tyler shook his head. It wasn't right. It wasn't human movement. James made a note. Birds can land on tents. Owls, for instance. Large owls can be quite heavy. Tyler gave him a look that was equal parts frustration and fear. I know what a bird feels like. This was not a bird. And birds don't speak Spanish. Fair point. Okay, James said. I'm going to file this report. If you think of any other details, let me know. In the meantime, I'd suggest taking a rest day before heading out again. Backcountry can play tricks on you when you're alone, especially at night. You think I imagined it? Tyler's voice was flat. I think you experienced something that scared you. Whether it was an animal, another person, or something else, I don't know yet, but I'm going to look into it. Tyler stood up, shouldering his pack. You know what? Forget it. I can tell you don't believe me. That's fine. But I'm telling you, there's something wrong in that canyon. Something wrong in this whole park. I did my research before coming here. I read the stories about weird things happening in Big Bend. Lights in the desert. People going missing. I thought it was just folklore, but it's not, is it? What stories? James asked, though he had a sinking feeling he already knew. La Lechuza, the Owl Witch. I read about it last night after I heard the crying. There are dozens of reports from Big Bend over the years. Campers seeing giant owls. Hearing women crying in the desert. People who go into the backcountry and come back different. Or don't come back at all. Tyler met James's eyes. You've been here a long time. You must know about it. James chose his words carefully. I know the folklore, but in 27 years I've never seen anything that couldn't be explained rationally. Then you haven't been paying attention. Tyler walked away, leaving James sitting alone on the bench with his notebook full of details he didn't know what to do with. James spent the afternoon reviewing the incident reports Sarah had sent him. 7 reports over the last month, all describing unusual owl activity in various locations throughout the park. But when he cross-referenced them with a map, a pattern emerged. All 7 locations were in the southern part of the park, along the Rio Grande. All were remote backcountry sites. All were in areas that had once been, according to the historical records he dug up, considered sacred or forbidden by the indigenous peoples who had lived here long before white settlers arrived. James sat back in his chair, staring at the map. 27 years of rational thinking, of scientific explanation, of refusing to give in to superstition. All of it was being challenged by 7 incident reports and 1 terrified college kid. He could let it go. File the reports, warn the campers, let his replacement deal with it when they took over next week. He could retire with his worldview intact, his rational universe undisturbed. Or he could do the one thing he'd avoided for his entire career. He could take the folklore seriously. James pulled up Google again and started researching in earnest. The Lechuza legend went back centuries in Mexican and Tejano folklore. The details varied by region, but certain elements remained consistent. Lechuzas were witches who transformed into giant owls, usually as punishment for practicing dark magic or making deals with evil spirits. They hunted at night, often targeting those who had wronged them or their families. They could speak human languages and mimic human voices. They fed on fear and sometimes on human flesh or organs. They were associated with death, curses, and vengeful justice. Traditional protections included salt, religious symbols, specific prayers, and refusing to acknowledge them when they called your name. According to some sources, Lechuzas couldn't cross running water and were repelled by certain herbs, particularly ruta, or rue. James kept reading, going deeper into academic folklore studies, anthropological reports, historical accounts from early Spanish missionaries. The more he read, the more uncomfortable he became. Because what he was reading matched what people were reporting. Not vaguely, not coincidentally, exactly. The crying sounds, the Spanish and English speech, the stalking behavior, the violation of shelter, the association with specific territories and places of power. James closed his laptop and rubbed his eyes. This was insane. He was a scientist. He had a degree in wildlife biology. He believed in evidence and data and rational explanation. But he also believed in patterns, and this was a pattern he couldn't ignore. His phone rang. The visitor center. Hartley. James, it's Sarah. We just got another call. Campers at Ernst Tenaya. They're requesting immediate ranger assistance. Said there's an owl attacking their campsite. James grabbed his keys. Tell them to get inside their vehicle if they have one, seal themselves in. I'm on my way. Ernst Tenaya was 45 minutes away on rough roads. James made it in 30, driving faster than he should have. The sun was just setting, the desert taking on that golden quality that photographers loved. In an hour, it would be full dark. He found the campers, a couple in their 60s in a well-equipped RV, standing outside their vehicle, looking shaken but unharmed. Thank God you're here, the woman said. That thing, it was trying to get inside the RV. We could hear it on the roof scratching at the vent. Are you injured? No, but Ranger, this isn't normal owl behavior. We've been RVing for 20 years. We know wildlife. That thing... She trailed off. Show me where you last saw it. They led him around to the far side of the RV. In the dust, illuminated by James's flashlight, were tracks. Bird tracks, talons and drag marks from tail feathers. But the size was wrong. Each talon print was easily 4 inches long, the spread of the foot nearly 8 inches across. No owl in North America had feet that large. James photographed the tracks with his phone, measured them, took notes. The couple watched him nervously. What do we do? The husband asked. I want you to leave, James said. Right now. Go back to the main campground at Rio Grande Village. Don't stop. Don't camp anywhere else. When you get there, talk to the ranger on duty. File a formal incident report. What about you? I'm going to stay here. Set up some camera traps. Try to document what's happening. The woman touched his arm, Ranger, my abuela, my grandmother, she was from Coahuila, just across the border. She used to tell stories about lechuzas. She said they were real. Said her own sister was taken by one when she was a girl. James looked at her. What else did she say? She said you can't fight them with guns or weapons. They're not animals. They're something else. Something that used to be human but traded their soul for power. And she said... The woman's voice dropped to a whisper. She said they're always hungry, always angry, and they never forget a wrong. James waited until the RV disappeared down the road before setting up his equipment. He had 3 trail cameras, motion-activated, infrared. He positioned them in a triangle around the campsite, angles overlapping to ensure coverage. Then he built a fire in the stone ring and settled in to wait. The desert night came on fast, temperature dropping 20 degrees in as many minutes. James sat close to the fire, watching the darkness beyond the circle of light. Above him, stars emerged in their thousands. The Milky Way sprawled across the sky like a scar. This was stupid. He should have left with the RV couple. Should have reported the incident and let search and rescue or wildlife services handle it. Should have spent his last week doing paperwork and avoiding anything that might delay his retirement. But he was here now. Might as well see it through. Around 10 p.m. the crying started. It came from the direction of the tinajas, the water holes that gave this place its name. A long, mournful wail that echoed off the canyon walls. James's skin prickled. It sounded exactly like a woman in distress. He stood up, adding more wood to the fire. The crying came again, closer now. He could hear the echo shifting, changing position. Whatever was making the sound was circling the camp. James reached for his sidearm, a Glock 22, .40 caliber standard Park Service issue. He'd fired it exactly twice in 27 years, both times at rattlesnakes that had gotten too close to visitor areas. He told himself it was just for comfort, that whatever was out there wouldn't require a gun. He wasn't sure he believed that anymore. The crying stopped abruptly. Silence fell over the desert, so complete that James could hear his own heartbeat. He turned slowly, scanning the darkness beyond the firelight, and there at the very edge of the light, perched on a boulder perhaps 30 feet away, was the owl. It was massive, easily 4 feet tall, maybe larger. Its feathers were mottled brown and gray, its ear tufts prominent. Its talons gripped the rock, each toe as long as James's fingers. And its eyes reflected the firelight with an intelligence that was absolutely, terrifyingly, not animal. James stared at it. It stared back. "You're not real," James said quietly. "You're just a bird, a large great horned owl, that's all." The owl tilted its head at an angle no real owl's neck could achieve, and then it spoke. "You don't believe that." The voice was female, accented, old. It came from the owl, but also from somewhere else, as if the desert itself was speaking. James's hand tightened on his gun. "What are you?" "You know what I am. Your people have stories about me. Different words, different names. But you know. Lechuza." The word felt strange in James's mouth. The owl, the thing that looked like an owl, made a sound that might have been laughter. "That is one name. I had another once when I was like you, before I made my choice. You're not real. This isn't happening. Tell me, Ranger." The owl's wings spread wide, impossibly wide. In all your years in this desert, did you never wonder why some places feel different? Why certain canyons echo with voices when no one is there? Why people disappear from trails they know well? Why the old ones warned against traveling at night? James said nothing. His worldview was cracking. The rational framework he'd built his life on collapsing piece by piece. "This land remembers," the owl said. "It remembers who lived here before your people, who honored the old ways, who respected the boundaries between worlds. Your kind comes here now thinking this is a park, thinking nature is something to be managed and controlled and commodified. But you're wrong. This place has never been tame, and it never will be." The people you're terrorizing, they haven't done anything wrong. They have permits. They're following the rules. Your rules, not mine, not the rules that were here first. The owl's eyes gleamed. But I am not unreasonable. I offer you a choice. 7 days you have left, yes? 7 days until you leave this place. Go now. Tonight. Do not come back. And I will leave your people alone until you are gone. And if I don't, then I will hunt. And this time, I will not simply watch and warn. I will feed. James raised his gun, aimed it at the owl. His hand was steady despite the fear coursing through him. 27 years of professionalism, of protocol, of keeping people safe. He couldn't walk away. I won't let you hurt anyone. The owl's laughter was like wind through bones. You think your weapon can harm me? You think bullets touch what I am? I think you've gone to a lot of trouble to threaten me instead of just killing me. Which means you're not as powerful as you want me to believe. The owl's eyes narrowed. For a moment, James thought he'd gone too far. Thought he'd pushed too hard and was about to find out exactly what a lechuza could do to someone who challenged it. But then the owl spoke again, and there was something almost like respect in its voice. You are braver than most. Or more foolish. Perhaps both. It shifted on the rock, wings folding. Very well. You want to protect your people? Then do so. But know this. I will test you. I will come for them one by one, until you understand that this is not your land to protect. Until you understand that some territories belong to older powers. Bring it on, James said, though his voice shook slightly. The owl laughed once more, a sound like shattering glass, and launched into the air. Its wings made no sound. It flew directly over James's head, close enough that he could feel the displacement of air, and vanished into the darkness. James stood alone by the fire, gun still raised, breathing hard. His entire body was shaking now, adrenaline crash hitting all at once. He'd just had a conversation with something that shouldn't exist, something that defied everything he knew about biology and reality, and it had declared war on him. James lowered his gun and sat heavily on the ground. He had 7 days until retirement, 7 days to figure out how to stop something that might not be stoppable. 7 days to save people from a threat he'd spent his entire career refusing to believe in. He looked up at the stars. The same stars that had looked down on this desert for millennia before parks and permits and people who thought they could control nature. Well, James said to the empty darkness, this is going to be an interesting week. The next morning, James drove back to the station with 3 trail cameras full of footage. He locked himself in the office and reviewed every frame. The cameras had recorded the entire encounter. They'd captured the owl landing on the rock. They'd captured it spreading its wings. They'd captured it taking flight. But they hadn't captured it speaking. On the footage, there was only silence where James clearly remembered hearing a voice. And when he looked closely at the frames where the owl sat on the rock, he could see something that made his blood run cold. Behind the owl's body, perfectly visible, was the boulder it sat on. As if the owl wasn't entirely solid. As if it existed partially in this world and partially in another. James downloaded the footage to a thumb drive and locked it in his desk drawer. He couldn't share this with anyone. They'd think he'd lost his mind. Hell, maybe he had. But he had work to do. He pulled up the park's reservation system and started making calls. Every backcountry permit for the next 7 days, every solo camper, every group, every site in the Southern District, he called them all. This is Ranger Hartley from Big Bend. I'm calling about your backcountry permit. We've had several reports of unusual wildlife activity in your area. For your safety, I'm going to suggest you either cancel your trip or relocate to a different area of the park. Some people listened. Some people thought he was overreacting. One guy accused him of trying to keep the good campsites for himself. But by the end of the day, James had managed to clear most of the backcountry sites in the Southern District. It wasn't perfect, a few permits he couldn't reach, a couple who refused to change their plans, but it was better than nothing. Sarah poked her head into his office around 5 p.m. Hey, James, People are starting to talk. Words getting around that you're discouraging people from camping in half the park. The superintendent's office called. They want to know what's going on. James rubbed his face. Tell them we have a potential wildlife hazard under investigation. I'm being cautious. James, come on. What's really happening? He looked at her. Young, smart, genuinely concerned. She deserved honesty, but what could he say that wouldn't sound insane? There's something in the backcountry, he said carefully. Something dangerous. I don't know exactly what it is yet, but I know it's targeting campers. And I know we need to keep people out of certain areas until I figure out how to deal with it. Sarah studied him. You look like you haven't slept. I haven't. James, if there's something dangerous out there, we should close those areas officially. Get wildlife services involved. Do this properly. And tell them what? That there's a witch that turns into a giant owl terrorizing campers? James's laugh was bitter. They'd think I'd gone senile. No, I handle this my way. Your way? James, you retire in 6 days. Why are you doing this? Because it's my job. Because people are counting on me to keep them safe. And because... He paused. Because for 27 years I've told myself that everything has a rational explanation. That there's no such thing as the supernatural. That the old stories are just stories. And I need to know if I've been wrong this whole time. Sarah was quiet for a moment. Then, do you need help? No, but thank you. She left, and James sat alone in his office as the sun set outside. He had 6 days left. 6 days to stop something he didn't understand with resources he didn't have. He thought about the Lechuza's words. This land remembers. Maybe it was time James started remembering too. Started paying attention to the stories he'd dismissed. Started listening to the warnings he'd ignored. He pulled out his phone and called someone he hadn't spoken to in 5 years. Tom Bearcloud, the Ojibwe elder who told him about spirits in the forest. Tom had retired to a small house in Alpine, an hour north of the park. The phone rang 4 times before Tom answered. Hartley? That you? Yeah, Tom, it's me. Listen, I need your help. I need to know everything you know about Lechuzas. A long pause. Then, what happened? I think I just declared war on one. Another pause. Then quietly, you damn fool. I'll be there in 2 hours. Put coffee on. Tom Bearcloud arrived at the station at 10 p.m., carrying a leather satchel and looking older than James remembered. They sat in the office with the lights dim, and James told him everything. The reports, the encounter at Ernst Tinaya, the conversation with something that shouldn't exist. Tom listened without interrupting. When James finished, the old man was quiet for a long time. You know what you're asking for? Tom finally said. You're asking me to help you fight something that's been in this desert longer than your country has existed. Something that has power you don't understand and don't respect. I respect it now. Do you, or are you just scared? James thought about that. Both. Tom nodded slowly. Good. Fear is honest. Fear is smart. He opened his satchel and pulled out several items. Bundles of dried herbs, small cloth pouches, what looked like carved bone. What you're dealing with, Lechuza, owl witch, whatever you want to call it, it's not just an animal. It's not even just a witch. It's something that traded its humanity for power. And that kind of magic, that kind of transformation, it has a cost. It twists the soul. Makes hunger the only thing left. How do I stop it? You don't. Not really. Best you can do is drive it away for a while. Make it hurt enough that it decides easier prey is elsewhere. Tom laid out the herbs. This is ruta. Rue. Lechuzas hate it. Smells toxic to them. And this... He held up a small pouch. Salt and ashes mixed with prayer. Not the prayer of your church. Older prayers. The kind my people knew before missionaries came. I don't believe in prayer. You don't have to believe, you just have to do it. Tom met his eyes. Listen to me. If you're really going to do this, if you're really going to stand against this thing, you need to understand what you're fighting. It's not evil the way you think of evil. its wrongness. It's a violation of natural law, a human soul that couldn't die properly, that merged with something else, something from the spaces between. Between what? Between the world you see and the world that sees you back. Tom started bundling the herbs together, tying them with string. Hang these at entry points, doorways, tent flaps, windows. They won't stop it, but they'll slow it down. Make it work harder. And this. He pushed one of the cloth pouches across the desk. Wear this. Keep it close. It won't make you invisible, but it might make you less appetizing. James picked up the pouch. It felt warm, almost alive. What else? You can't fight it head on. It's stronger than you. Faster. It can fly, you can't. It can see in the dark. You need light. You need to be smart. Use what it wants against it. What does it want? Territory, respect, recognition. Tom leaned forward. It told you this land has rules older than your rules. It's right. This desert belonged to other people before your government drew lines on a map and called it a park. The Lechuza sees itself as a guardian of those old boundaries, as enforcer of old laws. So I'm fighting for a principle it doesn't recognize. Exactly. James was quiet, thinking. Then, what if I acknowledged it, acknowledged its claim? Would that be enough? Maybe, maybe not. Lechuzas are individuals like people. Each one has its own story, its own grudges. This one might just want you gone, or it might want something more. Like what? Like blood. The word hung in the air between them. So either I leave, or someone dies. Those are my options? Tom's expression was grim. Or you die. It offered you safe passage out. That's more than most people get. James thought about his retirement cabin, about fishing and quiet and leaving all this behind, about 7 more days of paperwork and handover meetings and walking away clean, about 27 years of protecting people who came to this park trusting that someone was watching out for them. I'm not leaving, James said. Tom sighed. Then we'd better figure out how to keep you alive. They spent the next 3 hours planning. Tom drew maps of the Southern District, marking places that had traditional significance, sacred sites, burial grounds, locations where the boundary between worlds was thinner. The Lechuza's territory, essentially. You need to understand, Tom said. You're not dealing with an animal following instinct. You're dealing with intelligence, strategy. It will learn your patterns, anticipate your moves, use your own tactics against you. So how do I beat something smarter than me? You don't fight on its terms. You change the game. Tom tapped the map. Most of its activity has been here, in the canyons near the Rio Grande. But look at the pattern. It's avoiding this area. He circled a region northeast of Ernst Tinaya. This section has had 0 reports. Why? James studied the map. That's where the old army outpost was. Fort something. Built in the 1800s. Abandoned after 30 years. Fort Stockton Satellite, I remember. My grandfather worked there briefly before they shut it down. Tom pulled out another map, this one hand-drawn and very old. According to the old stories, that area was already forbidden when white settlers arrived. The Yumano people who lived here before, they wouldn't go near it. Said something terrible happened there. A massacre, maybe. Or a curse. The fort got abandoned because soldiers kept disappearing. Officially, they blamed desertion and Apache raids. But the real reason was something else. So I'm supposed to lure a supernatural creature into an area avoided by other supernatural creatures? Sometimes the enemy of your enemy is just another enemy. But if you're lucky, they'll fight each other and leave you alone. It was insane. All of it was insane. James should be filing reports and signing paperwork, not planning battles with folklore armed with herbs and salt. But here he was. I need bait, James said. Something to draw it out. Tom looked at him seriously. You're the bait, James. It challenged you personally. It wants you gone. You've become part of its territory dispute. Great. But that's also your advantage. It's focused on you, which means as long as you're drawing its attention, other people are safer. James thought about that. thought about 5 more days of protecting campers by putting himself between them and something that hunted humans. "Okay," he said. "I'll be bait. But I'm doing it on my terms, in a location I choose. And I'm going to document everything. Because if this thing takes me, I want evidence that I wasn't just some crazy old ranger who lost his mind in his final week." Tom pulled out one more item from his satchel, a small digital recorder, old but functional. "Keep this running. Whatever happens, you document it." The next 4 days were the longest of James's life. He spent his days clearing campers from high-risk areas, setting up monitoring equipment, consulting with Tom about traditional protections. He strung rue bundles at campground entrances. He mixed salt and ash and prayer into lines across trails. He did things he'd spent 27 years scoffing at, and did them with absolute seriousness. Because every night the Lechuza came, it didn't attack directly. That wasn't its way. Instead, it probed, tested, learned. Night 1. James woke at 2 a.m. to find scratches on his truck windshield, 4 parallel gouges that hadn't been there before. Night 2. All the monitoring equipment in the Southern District failed simultaneously at sunset. Every camera, every sensor, every battery-powered device, dead. Night 3. James received a phone call at midnight from his own number. When he answered, he heard his own voice saying, "You can't win this." Night 4. Sarah didn't show up for work. They found her at home, alive but suffering from what doctors called severe anxiety attack. She said an owl had sat on her bedroom window all night, tapping the glass, whispering her name. The Lechuza was making it personal, showing James what it could do, demonstrating its power. And James was running out of time. On the 5th day, 2 days before his retirement, James made his decision. He was going to the old fort. He'd spend the night there, alone, and force a confrontation. Either he'd find a way to drive the Lechuza off or, well, better him than some unsuspecting camper. Tom tried to talk him out of it. "James, you don't know what's in that place. Could be worse than the Lechuza. Or it could be nothing. Could be just an abandoned fort with some bad history and local superstition. You believe that?" "No, but I'm doing it anyway." James spent the day preparing. He loaded his truck with equipment, flashlights, flares, the trail cameras that still worked, Tom's bundles of herbs, salt, water, the recorder. He wrote a letter to Sarah explaining where he'd gone and what he was doing. He sealed it in an envelope with instructions to open only if he didn't return by dawn. He left the station at sunset. The drive to the fort took 90 minutes on rough roads that barely qualified as roads anymore. James followed coordinates and map references, winding deeper into the backcountry until the truck could go no further. He got out and hiked the last mile on foot. The fort appeared in his flashlight beam like a ghost. Crumbling adobe walls, empty window frames, a collapsed roof open to the sky. Graffiti covered some walls. Modern visitors who'd found the place and left their marks. But underneath the spray paint, James could see older marks, symbols carved into the adobe. Warnings, maybe, or prayers. The air around the fort felt wrong. Thick, heavy, like pressure building before a storm. James set up his equipment in what had been the main building. He arranged the rue bundles at every opening, drew a circle of salt and ash around his position, set the cameras recording, started the audio recorder. Then he built a fire in the center of the circle and waited. The sun set. The desert cooled. Stars emerged in their thousands. And right on schedule, at full dark, the crying began. It came from all directions at once. That mournful, terrible sound that was almost human but not quite. James stayed inside his circle, feeding the fire, waiting. An hour passed. 2. The crying continued, sometimes close, sometimes distant, sometimes seeming to come from inside the ruined walls themselves. And then, at midnight exactly, it stopped. Silence fell. Absolute. No wind, no insects, no sound at all. James stood up, heart hammering. He could feel it watching him, could feel the weight of its attention like pressure on his skin. "I'm here," he called out. "This is what you wanted, isn't it? Me, alone, in your territory. So come on, let's finish this." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, a voice. "You brought me to this place, why?" "You know why. Because this place is older than you. And maybe it's stronger." Laughter echoed off the adobe walls. "You think these ruins frighten me? I was flying these skies when this fort was built. I was here when it fell. Then why won't you cross the threshold?" Silence. James had hit something. The lechuza was staying outside the walls, circling, but not entering. "This place belongs to older things than me," the voice admitted. "Things that have no love for the living, things that feed on death and regret, and the weight of terrible deeds." "Then we're both trapped," James said. "You can't come in. I won't go out. Stalemate. I am patient. You will have to leave eventually. And when you do..." Actually, I had a different idea. James pulled out his phone. No signal, but the voice recording app still worked. He'd prepared a statement, and now he played it. "This is Ranger James Hartley, Big Bend National Park. I am formally acknowledging that the lands comprising the southern district of this park, from Ernst Tinaja to the Rio Grande, constitutes territory claimed by entities predating federal designation. I acknowledge the presence and rights of these entities. I acknowledge that human access to these areas should be restricted and regulated according to traditional boundaries. I propose a formal agreement. These areas will be closed to overnight camping during new moon periods from sunset to sunrise. In exchange, I ask for safe passage for all visitors during daylight hours and on nights when the moon is visible. Do you accept these terms?" Silence. Then carefully, "You speak for your people?" "I speak for this park. For 5 more days anyway. After that, someone else will be in charge. But I'll make sure they know. I'll make sure the restrictions stay in place. And if they ignore you? If they open these lands despite your warnings? Then that's between you and them. But I've done what I can." More silence. James could feel something shifting, the pressure in the air changing. The lechuza was considering. Finally, "You are not like the others. You came here not believing. You would have died refusing to see. But you learned. You listened. You changed." A pause. "Very well. I accept your terms. The new moon will be mine. The rest of the month I will hunt elsewhere. And the people you've already scared? They'll be left alone? They will remember me, but I will not return for them." The voice softened slightly. "You were brave, Ranger. Foolish, but brave. Few would have stood against me. Fewer still would have sought to understand rather than destroy. I'm a ranger. It's my job to protect both the people and the park. That includes respecting what the park really is." "What it really is," the voice repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, your people never understood that. But perhaps you do now." James felt the presence withdrawing, the pressure lifting. The lechuza was leaving, accepting his terms, agreeing to boundaries. "Wait," James called out. "One more thing, what were you before you became this?" Silence. Then, so quietly he almost missed it. "I was a mother. My children were taken by soldiers, murdered. I made a bargain for power to punish those who took them. And when that was done, I had nothing left but hunger and anger and memory. I have been this way for 200 years. I do not remember kindness. I do not remember mercy. I remember only territory and vengeance." "I'm sorry," James said, and meant it. "So am I." And then she was gone. James felt it clearly, the moment when the lechuza's attention withdrew completely, leaving him alone in the ruins with just the fire and the stars. He stood there for a long time, breathing hard, unable to quite believe he'd survived, that he'd negotiated with a creature from folklore and lived. Eventually, he sat down, fed the fire, and waited for dawn. James Hartley retired on schedule 2 days later. His replacement was a young ranger named Martinez, fresh out of training, eager to prove himself. James spent those final 2 days briefing him extensively on the Southern District restrictions. New moon closures, James emphasized. Non-negotiable. I don't care if people complain or if it seems superstitious. Those areas stay closed from sunset to sunrise during new moon periods. Can I ask why? James thought about how to answer that. He could tell the truth, that there was something in those canyons that hunted humans, something that had negotiated territory rights with a retiring ranger. But that would sound insane. Instead, he said, wildlife protection. There are species in those areas that are extremely sensitive to human disturbance during certain lunar cycles. The restrictions are based on extensive observation and traditional ecological knowledge from indigenous consultants. It was true, in a way. Martinez accepted it, added the restrictions to his procedures manual, and promised to enforce them. James spent his last hours at the station cleaning out his desk, saying goodbyes, trying to process everything that had happened. Sarah hugged him, told him she'd miss him. Tom stopped by with a bottle of whiskey and a knowing look. You survived, Tom said simply. Barely. That counts. On his final evening, James drove back to Ernst Tinaya one last time. He sat by the fire ring where he'd first encountered the Lechutza, watching the sun set over the desert. He'd spent 27 years believing in rational explanations, in science over superstition, in manageable nature and documented phenomena. And in 1 week, all of that had been turned upside down. The world was bigger and stranger than he'd wanted to admit. There were things in the desert, in all wild places probably, that didn't fit into neat categories. Things that remembered when humans forgot. Things that had rules and territories and power that predated GPS coordinates and park boundaries. James had protected people from those things in the end, had negotiated a truce, had bought safety at the cost of his certainty about how reality worked. Was it worth it? He thought about Tyler Morrison, who'd survived his encounter and gone on to his Forest Service job. About the RV couple, who were alive because James had listened to their fear instead of dismissing it. About all the future visitors who would camp under restrictions they didn't understand, but which would keep them safe from things they'd never see. Yeah, it was worth it. As the last light faded, James thought he saw a shape on a distant ridge, large, winged, watching. He raised his hand in something that might have been a wave or a salute or an acknowledgement. The shape spread its wings and flew south toward the Rio Grande, disappearing into the gathering dark. James drove away from Big Bend that night and never returned. He bought his fishing cabin in East Texas like he'd planned. Spent his days on quiet lakes catching crappie and catfish, reading books in the shade. But sometimes on nights when the moon was new and the darkness felt heavy, he'd sit on his porch and listen. And sometimes he'd hear, very faintly, carried on wind from the southwest, the cry of something that was and wasn't an owl, and James would raise his coffee cup to the darkness. A toast to boundaries respected, to territories acknowledged, to the understanding that some places in this world belong to older powers. And he'd remember the week he learned that being a ranger meant protecting people not just from the wilderness they could see, but from the wilderness that saw them back. The desert keeps its secrets. The night has its hunters, and somewhere in Big Bend, on moonless nights, something flies between the canyons. Something that remembers when it was human, and hungers for a world long gone. But it hunts according to rules now. Boundaries negotiated by a retiring ranger who learned in his final week that respect matters more than understanding, that acknowledgement matters more than belief, that some territories are eternal, no matter what maps we draw, and that's enough. Location: Lassen Volcanic National Park, California. Date: August 19, 2019. Day 87 alone in the tower, and Kyle had started talking to himself. Not just muttering or thinking aloud, actual conversations complete with pauses for the imaginary other person to respond. He'd catch himself doing it and laugh, the sound sharp and strange in the enclosed space of the fire lookout cabin. 87 days of solitude at 8,500 feet elevation, surrounded by nothing but volcanic peaks and pine forest, stretching to every horizon. The human mind wasn't designed for this kind of isolation. It started inventing company. Kyle stood at the windows that formed all four walls of the lookout cabin. A 14 by 14-foot glass box perched atop a 40-foot tower like a lantern on a pole. 360 degrees of visibility, able to see for 30 miles in every direction on a clear day. His job was simple. Watch for smoke. Spot fires before they grew from cigarette-sized to catastrophe-sized. In a drought year like this one, with California burning and the Forest Service stretched thin, fire lookouts weren't romantic throwbacks. They were essential. The sunset was painting Lassen Peak orange and purple, the 457-foot volcano dominating the northern view like a broken tooth. Wisps of steam rose from fumaroles on its flanks, reminders that the mountain had erupted as recently as 1915 and could do so again. The whole park was volcanic. Cinder cones, lava flows, boiling mud pots, sulfur vents. Standing water steamed. The ground was warm to the touch in places. It was beautiful and alien and utterly indifferent to human presence. Kyle had been alone since June 1st. 3 months of waking at dawn, scanning the horizon with binoculars, marking weather observations every hour, eating freeze-dried meals rehydrated with water from the cistern, reading paperback novels by lamplight, sleeping in a narrow cot that folded against the wall. His only human contact was the radio, daily check-ins with the district office, occasional chatter with other lookouts scattered across the Cascade Range. Some days he didn't speak aloud at all except to say, "Clear, no smoke," into the radio handset. The isolation was supposed to be peaceful, meditative, a chance to disconnect from the digital world and reconnect with nature. That's what the recruitment material said. What they didn't mention was how the silence could become oppressive, how the endless watching could make you feel like you were the one being observed, how after weeks alone your mind started playing tricks. Kyle had started noticing the deer 3 weeks ago, not unusual in itself. Mule deer were common in Lassen, wandering through the volcanic landscape, browsing on shrubs and grasses. Kyle saw them daily, sometimes in groups of 5 or 6, but these deer were different. They appeared around the tower every evening right at sunset, always the same number, 7 of them, and they didn't behave like normal deer. Normal deer were skittish, alert, their heads constantly moving, ears swiveling to catch every sound, ready to bolt at the first hint of danger. These deer stood motionless for minutes at a time, staring up at the tower, not grazing, not moving, just standing and watching with a stillness that felt wrong, felt calculated. At first, Kyle had dismissed it as pattern recognition gone haywire, his brain inventing meaning in random animal behavior because he was desperate for anything interesting to break the monotony. But the pattern held. Every evening. 7 deer. Arranged in a loose circle around the tower's base, roughly 50 yards out. Standing. Watching. Until full dark, when they'd melt back into the forest. Kyle raised his binoculars now, scanning the tree line as the light faded. There, movement among the pines. 1 deer stepped into the clearing, followed by another, then a third, 4, 5, 6, 7. They emerged from different directions, but with an odd synchronization, as if responding to a signal Kyle couldn't perceive. He focused the binoculars on the nearest one, a large buck with an impressive rack of antlers. Through the magnification, he could see details. The texture of its coat, the darkness of its eyes, the way it stood completely still except for the occasional flick of its tail. And then it moved its head, turning to look directly at the tower, and Kyle's stomach tightened. The movement was wrong. Not dramatically wrong, not grotesquely wrong, just off. The head rotated too smoothly, too much like a mechanical gimbal and not enough like a living animal's natural motion. And when the deer shifted its weight, its front legs bent in a way that made Kyle's hindbrain scream wrongness. The joints seemed to have too many angles, the hooves planted at a slightly incorrect angle to the ground. Kyle lowered the binoculars and rubbed his eyes. 87 days alone, his brain was making up problems where none existed. These were just deer. Ordinary mule deer doing ordinary deer things. The odd behavior was his own perception, warping under the weight of solitude. He turned away from the windows and busied himself with evening tasks, marking the day's weather observations in his logbook, checking the propane level for the camp stove, organizing his meager food supplies, enough for another 2 weeks before his next resupply, when a ranger would hike up the trail with fresh provisions. Kyle heated water for coffee, more out of routine than any desire to drink it. The coffee was terrible. Instant powder that tasted like burned cardboard. But it was warm and familiar and gave his hand something to do. The radio crackled. "All stations, this is Central Dispatch, evening check-in." Kyle grabbed the handset. "Prospect Peak Lookout, this is Kyle Mercer checking in. Clear skies, no smoke, winds calm, all good here." "Copy, Prospect Peak. Forecast shows high pressure holding for the next 72 hours. Stay alert. Humidity's dropping below 15%. Any spark could go big." "Roger that, staying vigilant." "How you holding up out there, Kyle? You're coming up on 3 months solo." Kyle glanced at the windows, at the darkening forest beyond. The deer were still there, 7 silhouettes in the gathering gloom. "I'm good. Quiet. Peaceful. Living the dream." "Well, only 2 more weeks until rotation. Hang in there. Central out." Kyle set down the handset and poured his coffee. 2 more weeks. 14 days. 336 hours. He could do that. He'd already done 87 days. What was 14 more? He carried the coffee to the north-facing window and looked out at Lassen Peak, now just a dark shape against the last purple glow of sunset. And there, in his peripheral vision, movement. One of the deer had stepped closer. Not by much. Maybe 10 yards, but definitely closer than where it had been. Kyle turned his head slowly to look directly at it. The deer stood motionless, its head angled up toward the tower. In the dim light, its eyes caught the glow from Kyle's lamp and reflected back yellow-green, like a cat's eyes. Deer eyes didn't do that. Deer eyes reflected white or amber, not that peculiar greenish glow. "You're losing it," Kyle muttered to himself. "It's just the angle of the light, just normal deer eyes." But even as he said it, he didn't quite believe it. He watched for another hour as full darkness settled over the mountain. The deer didn't move except for occasional small shifts in position, and each shift brought them incrementally closer. Not obviously closer, not rushing the tower closer, just a slow, patient contraction of the circle. By the time Kyle could no longer see them in the darkness, just vague shapes among trees, they'd closed the distance from 50 yards to maybe 30. Kyle pulled the curtains across the windows. Thin fabric that wouldn't stop anyone from seeing in if they tried, but at least created the psychological comfort of a barrier. He folded down his cot and lay on it fully clothed, staring at the ceiling. Sleep didn't come easily at the best of times up here. The altitude, the isolation, the endless quiet, broken only by wind and the occasional owl. Tonight it was worse. Every small sound made him tense. A gust of wind rattling the guy wires that stabilized the tower. A branch scraping against the metal support legs. Something that might have been footsteps on gravel but was probably just his imagination. Somewhere around midnight he finally drifted into uneasy sleep and woke to the sound of something walking around the tower. Kyle sat up instantly, heart hammering. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, providing just enough illumination to see the cabin's interior. He checked his watch. 3:47 a.m. Outside, the footsteps continued, a slow, deliberate circuit of the tower's base. Not human footsteps. The rhythm was wrong for bipedal movement. 4 feet, definitely 4 feet, but the gait wasn't right. The spacing between steps was irregular, as if whatever was walking couldn't quite remember how quadrupedal locomotion was supposed to work. Kyle moved silently to the east window and pulled the curtain back an inch. The tower stood in a small clearing surrounded by pine forest, 40 feet of metal and wood elevating the cabin high enough to see over the trees. Directly below, illuminated by moonlight, was one of the deer. It was walking in a circle around the tower's base, its head tilted up at an unnatural angle, staring at the cabin above. As Kyle watched, it completed the circuit and began another lap. The movement was mechanical, obsessive, not an animal checking its territory or looking for food. This was something else. This was reconnaissance. Kyle let the curtain fall and backed away from the window. His rational mind offered explanations. Nocturnal animals were active at night. Deer sometimes exhibited unusual behavior. He was sleep-deprived and misinterpreting normal wildlife activity. But the animal part of his brain, the part inherited from ancestors who'd survived by recognizing predators, was screaming danger. He went to the radio and picked up the handset, then hesitated. What was he going to say? That a deer was walking around his tower and it made him uncomfortable? Central Dispatch would think he'd cracked from isolation. They might pull him off the mountain early, mark him as unsuitable for solo assignments. His career would be over before it properly started. Kyle set down the handset without transmitting. The footsteps below continued for another 10 minutes, then stopped. Kyle waited in silence, barely breathing, listening. Nothing. He crept back to the window and looked out. The deer was gone. The clearing was empty. He didn't sleep again that night. Dawn broke clear and hot, the sun rising over the Warner Mountains to the east and turning the volcanic landscape gold. Kyle made coffee and performed his morning routine on autopilot. Weather observations, radio check-in, visual scan for smoke. Everything normal, everything fine. The night's strangeness seemed absurd in daylight. He was halfway through his powdered eggs when he noticed the marks. From the cabin's elevation, Kyle could see the ground clearly around the tower's base. The area was mostly bare earth and volcanic gravel, with sparse grass and low shrubs. Easy to spot any disturbance. And there in the dusty soil were tracks. Dozens of them, not arranged in the scattered random pattern of animals passing through. These tracks formed concentric circles around the tower. Multiple laps, overlapping, as if something, or several somethings, had walked around and around the structure throughout the night. Kyle grabbed his binoculars and focused on the tracks. They looked like deer tracks. The distinctive split hoof shape was clear, but the depth was wrong. Too uniform, as if whatever made them had exactly the same weight on each foot, distributed with mechanical precision. Real animals shifted their weight, left deeper impressions on some steps, lighter on others. These tracks were eerily consistent, and there was something else. Mixed among the deer tracks were others, similar in shape but larger, with a different depth pattern, as if whatever made them had more weight distributed over a smaller surface area. The spacing suggested a longer stride. Kyle traced the line of these larger tracks with his binoculars, following them from the clearing into the tree line, and something was watching him. At the forest edge, barely visible among the pines, stood one of the deer. The large buck from last night, antlers spreading like skeletal hands. It was completely motionless, oriented directly toward the tower, and even from this distance Kyle could feel its attention focused on him with laser intensity. He lowered the binoculars. When he raised them again, the deer was gone. Kyle spent the day trying to distract himself with work. He cleaned the cabin's windows, organized his equipment, read weather reports from other stations, attempted to make progress on the novel he'd been slogging through for 2 weeks. But his attention kept drifting to the windows, to the forest, to the question of whether he was being watched. The deer appeared again at sunset. All 7 of them, emerging from the trees in that same unsettling synchronization. This time they were closer from the start, maybe 20 yards from the tower base. They arranged themselves in a loose circle, evenly spaced, and stood watching the cabin, watching Kyle. He tried to photograph them with his digital camera, thinking he'd have evidence, something to show people. But every photo came out wrong. The deer appeared as blurs or strange light artifacts or not at all, even when he could see them clearly with his naked eyes. He checked the camera settings. Everything was correct. It should be working. But the images were unusable, corrupted, as if something about these animals refused to be captured digitally. Kyle set down the camera and simply watched. The deer didn't move for over an hour. Then, as if responding to an unheard signal, They all took one step closer, perfectly synchronized. Then another step. The movements were too coordinated to be natural animal behavior. This was a group acting with unified purpose and intelligence. "What do you want?" Kyle said aloud, his voice sounding small and strange in the enclosed cabin. As if in response, the largest buck, the one Kyle had started thinking of as the Watcher, turned its head and fixed him with direct eye contact. Held the gaze, didn't blink. The message was clear even if Kyle didn't want to acknowledge it. "We know you're in there. We know you're alone. We're waiting." Kyle pulled all the curtains closed and turned off the lamp, sitting in darkness. He could hear them now, the soft scrape of hooves on gravel as they moved closer, the rustle of movement circling the tower. Testing, probing, looking for weakness. The radio crackled. "Prospect Peak. This is Central. Just checking in. We noticed your evening weather report was late." Kyle fumbled for the handset in the darkness. "Sorry, Central, got distracted. Everything's fine here. Clear skies, no smoke." "You sound stressed, Kyle. Everything okay?" Was it? Were 7 deer exhibiting strange behavior enough to report as an emergency? Would anyone believe him? "Just tired," Kyle said. "Long day." "Copy that. Get some rest. Central out." Kyle sat in the dark cabin, listening to the sounds below. Circling. Always circling. He thought about the isolation protocols drilled into every fire lookout during training. You're alone for extended periods. Your mind will play tricks. If you need help, call immediately. But what if calling for help meant admitting he couldn't handle the assignment? What if this was all in his head? The circling stopped suddenly. Complete silence. Then, scraping. Metal on metal. Something was testing the tower's support legs. The ladder. The hatch that led from the ladder into the cabin floor. Kyle's breath caught. The hatch was secured with a simple latch, designed to keep it from blowing open in wind, not to keep anything out, if something wanted in badly enough. The scraping stopped. Silence again, somehow worse than the sound. Kyle sat frozen in darkness for what felt like hours. Eventually, exhaustion overcame fear and he dozed in the chair, waking repeatedly to check the windows, seeing nothing but darkness and occasionally catching a glimpse of movement at the edge of the clearing. When dawn finally came, the deer were gone, but the tracks had multiplied. Dozens of circuits around the tower, patterns overlapping into a maze of prints, and there, next to the base of the tower, were long scratches in the dirt, parallel lines like something had dragged claws or hooves in systematic patterns, testing the ground, measuring, planning. Day 88, day 89, day 90. The pattern continued. Each night the deer returned closer and more numerous. Kyle counted 8 now, then 9, then 11. They didn't appear all at once anymore. They filtered in from the forest over the course of the evening, taking up positions around the tower until he was surrounded. And each night they pushed the boundary closer, tightening the circle. Kyle stopped sleeping, or couldn't sleep. The distinction blurred. He dozed in fitful bursts during the day, jerking awake at every sound. At night, he sat at the windows with binoculars and his emergency spotlight, watching the deer watch him. Sometimes one would break from the circle and approach the tower base, sniffing at the support legs, nosing at the ladder. Then it would retreat, and another would take its place, as if they were taking turns investigating, gathering information. The scratches on the ground grew more elaborate. Not random marks now, patterns, circles and lines radiating from the tower like a diagram. Kyle tried to photograph them during the day, but again the images wouldn't capture properly. The marks appeared as light anomalies or blank spaces, as if something in their nature resisted documentation. He called Central Dispatch less frequently, keeping his reports brief and professional. Any hint of paranoia or fear would mean immediate extraction, psychological evaluation, end of assignment. He couldn't let that happen. Not yet. He needed to understand what was happening first. Needed proof. On day 92, Kyle found the remains. He'd descended the tower for the first time in days. A dangerous decision, but he'd run out of water and the cistern was at ground level. The ladder descent felt endless, every step taking him closer to the circle's edge, closer to where they gathered each night. He carried his spotlight and a can of bear spray even though he knew neither would help if they were waiting. They weren't. The clearing was empty in the harsh afternoon sunlight. Kyle filled his water jugs quickly, trying not to look at the elaborate scratch patterns in the dirt. But something caught his eye at the forest edge, a shape that didn't belong. He approached cautiously. It was a deer, a normal deer, or what remained of one. The carcass was days old, torn apart by scavengers, but the head was intact, and Kyle could see immediately the difference. This deer's skull structure was normal. Its eye sockets were properly aligned. Its jaw articulated correctly. It was, in every way, an actual deer, unlike the things that visited his tower at night. Kyle stumbled back to the ladder and climbed frantically, hands shaking. Once inside the cabin, he locked the floor hatch, a futile gesture. The latch was flimsy, and sat with his back against the wall. His mind raced through implications he didn't want to accept. Those things weren't deer. They wore the shape of deer the way Kyle wore his ranger uniform, as a disguise, a costume that almost worked but couldn't quite hide what was underneath. The radio crackled. Not a call-in, just static. But underneath the static, something else. A sound like breathing. Or like many things, breathing in unison. Kyle grabbed the handset. "Central, this is Prospect Peak. Do you copy?" The breathing continued, overlaid with what might have been voices whispering in harmony. Not words. Just sound shaped like communication. "Central, respond." Kyle's voice cracked. "I need extraction. There's something wrong here. I need immediate extraction." The static cleared. Central Dispatch's voice came through normal and professional. "Prospect Peak, we didn't copy your last transmission. Please repeat. I need extraction. Now, there's..." Kyle stopped. How could he explain? "There's a situation here. I'm not safe. Are you injured? Is there a medical emergency?" "No, but..." "We're showing no weather alerts, no fire activity in your sector. Can you clarify the nature of the emergency?" Kyle looked out the window. The deer were emerging early today, the sun not even touching the horizon yet. 12 of them. No, 14. They arranged themselves in the now familiar circle, but tighter, closer. Maybe 15 yards from the tower base. Close enough that Kyle could see details even without binoculars, could see how their legs bent at joints that didn't match the underlying bone structure, how their eyes didn't blink often enough, how their mouths hung slightly open in expressions no real animal would make. "There are animals surrounding my position," Kyle said carefully. "They're behaving in a threatening manner. I don't feel safe." A long pause. Then, "Kyle, are we talking about deer? You're reporting deer as a threat?" "They're not..." He caught himself. "They're exhibiting unusual behavior. I believe I'm at risk." Another pause. Longer this time. Kyle could imagine the conversation at Central. The lookouts cracking. 3 months solo was too much. We need to pull him before he hurts himself. "Kyle, listen carefully. Your relief ranger is scheduled to arrive in 4 days as planned. We can potentially move that up by 1 day if absolutely necessary, but extracting you earlier would require helicopter support, and we have multiple active fires pulling resources. Unless you're reporting an immediate life-threatening emergency, the earliest we can get someone to you is 72 hours. Can you hold position for 72 hours? Kyle watched the deer. They'd begun moving, not circling, not approaching, just swaying slightly in place. All of them, in perfect synchronization. A hypnotic, disturbing motion like kelp in a current. "Kyle, respond please. Can you hold for 3 days? 3 days. 72 hours. Could he? The deer hadn't actually attacked. They'd done nothing but watch and circle and exist in his space. Maybe they were just animals with unusual behavior patterns. Maybe his isolation-addled brain had inflated the threat. Or maybe they were waiting for something, testing his defenses, learning his patterns the way he'd tried to learn theirs, preparing. "I can hold," Kyle heard himself say. 3 days. I'll be fine." "Good man. Stay alert. Stay safe. We'll get you down soon. Central out." Kyle set down the handset and returned to the window. The deer had stopped swaying. Now they stood motionless again, all facing the tower, and Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that they'd heard the radio transmission, that they understood he would be alone for 3 more days, that they knew. As the sun set, more emerged from the forest. Kyle counted 20, then 25. They filled the clearing now, arranged in concentric rings around the tower. The closest were 10 yards away. He could hear them breathing, a collective sound like wind through a cave, rhythmic and purposeful. Night fell, and Kyle turned off all lights, sitting in darkness. Below, the breathing continued. And then, around midnight, they began to hum. It wasn't a sound deer made. It wasn't a sound any animal made. It was a tone, low and resonant, seeming to come from the ground itself as much as from the creatures surrounding him. The frequency made Kyle's teeth ache and his vision blur. It vibrated through the tower's metal structure, turning the entire cabin into a tuning fork. The humming rose and fell in waves, modulated with what sounded like intelligence, like language. Kyle pressed his hands over his ears, but it didn't help. The sound was in his bones now, in his skull, making thought difficult. Then it stopped. In the sudden silence, Kyle heard a new sound. Scraping. Metal on metal. They were on the ladder. Multiple sets of hooves on the metal rungs, climbing, ascending toward the cabin floor and the flimsy latch that was the only barrier between Kyle and whatever these things were. Kyle grabbed his spotlight and aimed it at the floor hatch. The scraping grew louder, closer. He could see the hatch beginning to rattle as something pushed against it from below. "Stay back," Kyle shouted, his voice cracking. "I'm armed. Stay back." The rattling stopped. Silence for 5 seconds. 10. Then something slammed against the hatch from below. A tremendous impact that bent the metal and tore one of the latch's mounting screws free. Again. The metal shrieked. Again. The second screw popped loose and the latch hung by a single fastener. Kyle backed against the opposite wall. Bear spray in one hand, spotlight in the other. Utterly inadequate weapons against whatever was coming through that hatch. One more impact would do it. One more and they'd be inside, and he had nowhere to run because he was 40 feet in the air in a glass box with no exit except down the ladder they controlled. The silence stretched. The hatch hung crooked, held by a single screw, but nothing came through. Minutes passed. 5. 10. Kyle didn't move, didn't breathe, waiting for the final assault. It didn't come. Eventually, the scraping resumed, but descending now, moving down the ladder. Retreating, Kyle waited another hour before approaching the damaged hatch, shining his spotlight through the gap. The ladder was empty. Below, in the moonlit clearing, the deer had withdrawn to the forest edge, watching, waiting. They demonstrated they could break in whenever they wanted. The hatch wouldn't stop them. The walls wouldn't stop them. Kyle's presence in the tower was by their permission, not his own strength. They were just choosing not to come in yet. Dikeo. Day 93. Dawned gray and ominous. Smoke from distant fires hazing the horizon. Kyle hadn't slept. He'd spent the night sitting with his back to the wall, spotlight and bear spray ready, watching the broken hatch and the windows and the forest beyond. At first light, he'd used wire to secure the hatch, knowing it was pointless but needing to do something. Anything. The deer were gone during the day now, but Kyle could feel them out there in the forest, watching from the shadows. 40 or 50 of them, he estimated, maybe more. The forest around Prospect Peak had never supported that many deer. They were coming from elsewhere, gathering, assembling a force. For what? Kyle tried the radio. "Central, this is Prospect Peak. I need to update my situation report." Static. He adjusted the frequency, tried again. More static. "Central Dispatch, this is Prospect Peak Lookout. Do you copy?" Nothing. The radio was working. He could hear the carrier wave, the background hiss of open channel. But no one was responding. Or no one was there. Or something was blocking the transmission? Kyle tried for an hour, cycling through all available frequencies. Weather channels, emergency channels, ranger-to-ranger frequencies. All empty, all silent except for that underlying hiss that sometimes sounded like breathing, like the collective exhalation of the things surrounding his tower. He was cut off. Truly alone now. No help coming. Just him and them and 2 days until his relief ranger hiked up the trail. If the ranger could even reach the tower, if the things would let anyone approach. Kyle spent the day preparing. He had minimal supplies. The tower wasn't designed as a fortress, but he inventoried everything. 2 cans of bear spray, a multi-tool, 50 feet of rope, a fire extinguisher, batteries, his spotlight, matches, propane for the stove. He moved everything flammable away from the walls, cleared the center of the cabin, tried to think tactically even though he had no idea what he was facing or how to fight it. The sun began its descent toward the horizon. Kyle watched it go with dread, counting down the minutes until they returned. He'd turned the cabin into as much of a defensive position as possible, but he had no illusions. If they wanted in, they'd get in. The question was why they hadn't yet. What were they waiting for? Sunset came. The deer emerged. 30 of them. 40. 50. They filled the clearing and spilled into the forest beyond, a living wall surrounding the tower. All facing in, all motionless, all watching. Kyle couldn't see the large buck, the watcher at first, then spotted it at the circle's north edge, larger than the others, antlers spreading like a crown. Full darkness fell, and the humming began again. Louder this time, coming from dozens of throats in harmony. The tower vibrated. Kyle's vision swam. He gripped the edge of a table to steady himself, fighting nausea as the resonant frequency burrowed into his brain. Then the watcher moved. It separated from the mass and approached the tower, moving with that wrong-jointed gait, head angled up. The humming crescendoed as it reached the tower base, then stopped abruptly. In the sudden silence, the watcher reared up on its hind legs. Impossible. Deer couldn't do that. Their anatomy didn't support bipedal posture, and placed its front hooves against the tower's support structure. Its voice echoed up the tower's framework, amplified by the metal. Kyle. His name. It knew his name. The voice was wrong. Too deep with harmonics that shouldn't exist, like multiple voices speaking in unison. But it was unmistakably calling him. Kyle, come down. The circle is complete. It's time. Kyle backed away from the window, breath coming in gasps. The voice continued, patient and implacable. You've been alone too long. Isolation breaks the mind. We understand. We remember. We were alone once. So we became many. We became together. Join us, Kyle. Come down and join the circle. Never be alone again. You're not real, Kyle said, his voice hoarse. Your isolation psychosis, hallucination, my mind breaking. Are we? The watcher's head tilted at an impossible angle. Or is your rational mind finally seeing what was always there? The spaces between spaces, the forms that watch from the corners of the map. We've been here longer than your forests, longer than your mountains. We wear these shapes because they're convenient, because they let us walk unnoticed. But we remember older shapes. Want to see? The deer surrounding the tower began to change. Not dramatically, not Hollywood transformation. Just subtle shifts, joints bending the wrong way, proportions elongating, fur seeming to flow like water across restructuring frames. They were shedding the deer disguise, revealing something underneath. Something that had learned to mimic animals but couldn't quite remember all the details of how animals were supposed to move and stand and be. Kyle's rational mind shattered. He'd been clinging to explanations. Unusual animal behavior, isolation-induced paranoia, natural phenomena misinterpreted. But what he was seeing now couldn't be explained, couldn't be rationalized. These things were real, and they'd been studying him for weeks, learning his patterns, testing his responses, waiting for the right moment. And now it was the right moment. The watcher dropped to 4 legs and began climbing the ladder. The metal rang with each impact of hooves on rungs. Impossible. Hooves couldn't grip ladder rungs, but physics seemed negotiable for these creatures. Others followed, creating a line ascending toward the cabin. Kyle grabbed the fire extinguisher and positioned himself by the broken hatch. When the first one pushed through, he'd spray it, hope the pressurized chemical would drive it back. It was a pathetic plan, but the only one he had. The hatch rattled. The wire holding it, secured, bent, snapped. The hatch fell open and something began pushing through. A head, too large, eyes that caught the lamplight and glowed that wrong yellow-green. Kyle triggered the extinguisher directly into its face. The chemical cloud filled the space, choking and blinding. The thing shrieked, a sound like metal tearing, and fell back down the ladder. Kyle slammed the hatch shut and braced his weight on it, knowing it wouldn't hold, that this was temporary at best. Impact from below. Again. Again. The hatch buckled. Kyle was thrown back as it tore open completely, metal shrieking. The opening gaped like a wound, and through it came the watcher. It pulled itself into the cabin with those wrong-jointed front legs, too long, bending in too many places. Its head swiveled and locked onto Kyle with predatory focus. Up close, the disguise was transparent. This was something wearing deer-shaped like a costume, the proportions not quite right, the movements not quite matching the form. "Last chance, Kyle," it said in its chorus voice. "Join willingly or join screaming. Both ways end the same. Alone becomes together. One becomes many. The circle closes." Kyle threw the emptied fire extinguisher. It bounced off the creature with no effect. He grabbed his spotlight and shone it directly in the thing's eyes, hoping light would do what chemicals hadn't. The watcher didn't flinch. It advanced, hooves scraping on the floor, backing Kyle against the windows. "Nowhere to run," it said. "Tower too high to jump. Forest too full to escape. We've been waiting so patiently, Kyle. Since the moment you arrived. We watched you settle in. Watched you grow comfortable. Watched isolation start to break you. And when you were ready, when you were desperate enough for any contact, even wrong contact, we made ourselves seen. Let you notice us. Because prey that's been alone too long will accept any company. Even ours." Other shapes were emerging through the hatch now, filling the cabin, surrounding him. Kyle could smell them. Not animal musk, but something else. Something metallic and cold and old. They pressed closer, and he had nowhere left to go. Just the windows at his back and 40 feet of empty air beyond. The watcher reached out with one foreleg, the hoof dissolving into something like fingers. Too many joints. Too many angles. "It's time," it said. "Time to stop being alone. Time to join the circle. Time to become we." Kyle felt the fingers' hooves touch his chest, felt something cold seeping through his clothes, through his skin, reaching for his heart. Felt his own thoughts beginning to blur and multiply. His sense of self fracturing and dividing like a cell undergoing mitosis. And in that moment of dissolution, a memory surfaced. Training. Fire lookout training. What to do if the tower was compromised, if you had to evacuate, if the only option was down. Kyle grabbed the rope from his equipment pile, 50 feet rated for climbing. He'd secured one end to the anchor point by his cot weeks ago as a safety measure, a last resort emergency escape. Now he wrapped the other end around his waist in a hasty, repelling knot, said a prayer to gods he didn't believe in, and threw himself backward through the window. Glass shattered. Cold air rushed past. The rope snapped tight, and Kyle slammed against the tower's support structure 40 feet above ground, the impact driving air from his lungs. Above, the creatures shrieked in unison, a sound of pure, frustrated rage. Kyle didn't wait. He descended hand over hand, rappelling down the tower, ignoring the burn in his palms and the creatures pouring out of the cabin above, scrambling down the external structure like enormous spiders. 20 feet, 10, 5. His boots hit dirt and he ran. The forest was full of them. Dozens. Hundreds, maybe. They moved between trees in a coordinated swarm, trying to cut off his escape routes, herd him back toward the tower. But Kyle knew this mountain. knew the trails and the rock formations and the hidden paths. He ran through darkness, spotlight forgotten, navigating by moon and starlight and desperate memory. Behind him, the collective shriek rose and fell, a siren of pursuit. They were faster than him, tireless where he was already gasping for breath. But they were pack hunters accustomed to surrounding and overwhelming. Single prey running a random pattern confused them, forced them to adapt their strategy on the fly. Kyle broke through a line of brush and found himself on the trail, the main hiking path down the mountain. 3 miles to the ranger station at the base. 3 miles of exposed trail where they could catch him easily, but also 3 miles of downward slope where gravity was his ally, and their quadrupedal forms less efficient. He ran harder than he'd ever run, legs burning, lungs screaming. The shrieking behind grew louder, closer. He could hear the scrabble of hooves on stone, the rustle of many bodies moving through undergrowth in parallel. They were flanking him, trying to cut him off at the switchbacks where the trail doubled back. One of them burst from the trees ahead, the Watcher, antlers silhouetted against stars. It positioned itself in the center of the trail, blocking his path. Kyle didn't slow. He lowered his shoulder and charged, hitting the creature's center mass before it could react, feeling that wrong texture of too many joints buckling under the impact. They both went down in a tumble of limbs and antlers. Kyle rolled to his feet first and kept running, left arm streaming blood from antler gashes he didn't feel yet. More switchbacks, more trail. The sounds of pursuit were everywhere now, ahead, behind, to both sides. They'd given up trying to hurt him and simply surrounded him in a moving sphere, closing gradually, patient in the knowledge that he'd eventually tire. And then lights, human lights. The ranger station ahead, windows glowing yellow. Kyle put everything he had left into a final sprint, crashed through the door without slowing, slamming it behind him. Found himself face to face with 3 rangers he'd never seen before, who stared at him in shock as he collapsed, gasping. "Lock the doors," he managed. "Windows. Lock everything. They're right behind me." "Who's behind you?" One of the rangers moved to the window, peered out. "I don't see anyone." Kyle crawled to the window and looked. The forest was empty. Silent. No creatures. No pursuit. No sign that anything had chased him down 3 miles of mountain trail. Just trees and darkness and the distant call of an owl. They were there, Kyle said, but even to his own ears it sounded insane. They were right there. Hundreds of them. They broke into my tower. One of the rangers was already on the radio, calling for medical evac. Another wrapped Kyle's bleeding arm in bandages. The third kept watching him with the careful wariness of someone dealing with a mental health crisis. "You're Kyle Mercer, right? From Prospect Peak?" At Kyle's nod. "We've been trying to reach you for 2 days. Radio's been out. Figured maybe a lightning strike took out your equipment. Didn't expect..." He gestured vaguely at Kyle's disheveled, bleeding state. "They were in the tower," Kyle insisted. "Dear but not dear. They could talk. They wanted me to join them, to become part of their circle. I barely got out." The rangers exchanged glances. Kyle could see them making the calculation. 3 months of isolation, obvious psychological break, possible self-injury, needs immediate psychiatric evaluation. "We believe you," one of them said in a tone that meant exactly the opposite. "Just rest. Help's coming. You're safe now." But Kyle wasn't sure he was safe. Wasn't sure safety was even possible when you'd seen what he'd seen. Because as he sat there, wrapped in a blanket and drinking water a concerned ranger pressed into his hands, he could see out the window, could see the tree line, could see 7 deer standing motionless at the forest edge, watching the ranger station, watching him. The rangers didn't seem to notice them, didn't react, maybe couldn't see them at all. Maybe Kyle was the only one who could see anymore, who'd looked too long at something that should stay unseen. The largest buck, the Watcher, turned its head and locked eyes with Kyle across the distance. Its mouth opened in something like a smile. Then the deer melted into the forest and were gone. Official Incident Report. Excerpt. Ranger Kyle Mercer was extracted from Prospect Peak Fire Lookout on August 22, 2019, following a psychological episode attributed to acute isolation syndrome. Subject presented with paranoid delusions, claiming to be pursued by hostile wildlife. Minor injury sustained, consistent with self-inflicted trauma during confused state. Radio equipment at Prospect Peak Lookout was found non-functional due to damaged antenna assembly. Cause: consistent with animal activity. Several components showed bite marks and scratch patterns matching native deer population. Ranger Mercer has been placed on medical leave pending psychiatric evaluation. Assignment to remote solo posts not recommended. Tower's structural integrity remains sound. Emergency repairs to floor hatch completed. Station returned to operational status August 30, 2019, with 2-person crew assigned. Note: new crew reports unusual deer activity around tower during evening hours. Recommend wildlife management consult regarding possible habituated deer population. Adieu go. Kyle never returned to fire lookout duty. He took a desk job with the Forest Service in Sacramento, processing permits and reviewing reports. Safe, boring, human. But sometimes, driving home from work, he'd catch movement in his peripheral vision. A shape at the roadside that looked like a deer but moved wrong. Or he'd see 7 deer arranged in a circle in a park, all facing inward, all motionless. Or he'd hear underneath the city's ambient noise a faint humming that made his teeth ache. The watcher had said the circle was complete. That alone would become together. That one would become many. Kyle had escaped the tower, but he'd never really escaped. Every sunset he counted the deer he saw throughout his day, and when the count reached 7, he went home and locked his doors and waited for the humming to begin. It always did. Eventually,